She walked into his garage with nothing but a resume and a secret worth billions, and he almost sent her away with 4 words that should have ended everything before it began. Struggling mechanic, a billionaire in disguise, one accidental confession that changed both their lives forever. This is the story of 2 people who found each other in the most unlikely place and had to decide whether what they built together was worth more than everything they stood to lose. This kind of story speaks to you real people, impossible choices, love that nobody saw coming. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And before we go any further, drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The storm came in fast that Tuesday, the way Colorado storms always did in October, no warning. Just a wall of gray moving down from the mountains until the sky turned the color of old concrete. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. Landon Pierce was already underneath the Henderson's F-250 when the first thunder cracked, and he didn't bother coming out. He had an exhaust manifold to replace, a customer coming at noon he'd completely forgotten to put in the book, and somewhere in the back office a stack of invoices he'd been avoiding for 11 days. Storm could do whatever it wanted. His problems were already here. He worked the way he always worked, methodically, without music, listening to the engine the way a doctor listens to a chest. His hands were capable hands, the kind that knew the difference between a bolt that needed another quarter turn and one that was already done. He'd been a mechanic since he was 15, learning in his father's shop before his father's heart gave out and left Landon with the building, the tools, the debt, and a 5-year-old son who didn't understand why Grandpa wasn't coming back. That had been 4 years ago. Caleb was 9 now, and Landon was 32, and Pierce Auto Works was still standing, which some days felt like the only victory he could honestly claim. He heard the bell above the front door. He assumed it was Danny, his part-time guy who was supposed to start at 8 and consistently arrived at 8:20. He didn't come out from under the truck. "Be right with you," he called. The footsteps that crossed the concrete floor were not Danny's. They were lighter, more deliberate, and they stopped about 4 feet from the truck's rear bumper. Landon slid out on the creeper. She was standing there in dark jeans, a plain gray jacket, and flat shoes that had clearly seen real weather before. No umbrella, though she'd obviously walked through the rain. There was a damp line across her shoulders, and her dark hair was pulled back with a few strands loose at her temple. She was holding a single folded sheet of paper in one hand. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, maybe slightly less. Her expression was composed in the way that people's expressions get when they've learned to keep their reactions to themselves. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't performing confidence either. She was just standing there, steady, waiting for him to say something that merited a response. Landon became abruptly aware that he was lying on a creeper with grease on both forearms and a smear of something dark across his left cheek. He sat up. He ran the back of his wrist across his forehead, which accomplished nothing. He stood. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't hear you pull in." "The storm's loud," she said, which was true and required no further comment from either of them. She extended the folded paper. "I saw your ad. Operations manager. I'm here about the position." Landon looked at the paper. Then he looked at her again. Here's what he should have said. "Thank you for coming in. A seat and we'll get started." Here is what he actually said. Because he was exhausted. Because he'd been awake since 5. Because the invoice stack in the back had been quietly terrorizing him for a week and a half. And because his brain-to-mouth filter had apparently stopped functioning somewhere around the 2nd hour under the truck. "Honestly, I don't need an operations manager. What I need is a wife." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that forms when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. The woman looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned around and walked toward the door. "Wait," Landon was moving before he'd consciously decided to move. "Wait, I'm sorry." That came out completely wrong. That was he stopped, because there was no good way to finish that sentence. Stupid thing to say. "I'm sorry." She had her hand on the door handle. She didn't open it. "I've been under that truck since 6, he said. "I haven't slept right in about a week. I've got invoices I can't figure out, a scheduling system that doesn't work, and a son who needs help with fractions that I am absolutely not qualified to provide." "I didn't mean, I wasn't implying that you—" He stopped again. "I'm Landon Pierce. This is my shop, and I am genuinely sorry. If you want to leave, I completely understand. But if you'd be willing to give me 20 minutes to show you what the job actually involves, I would appreciate the chance." She was quiet for a moment. She let go of the door handle. 45 minutes, she said. "Not 20. If I'm going to assess whether a position is worth my time, I need to actually see the operation. 45 is fine, and if I decide it isn't worth my time, I walk out without any further discussion." "Fair." She turned around. Sloane Kensington. Landon Pierce. He glanced at his hand, decided against offering it given the grease situation. "Can I get you coffee?" "Please." Coffee was bad. Landon knew it was bad before he poured it. He'd made it 3 hours ago, and it had been sitting on the burner long enough to reach the consistency of something you'd use to seal a driveway. He handed her the mug with a look that preemptively acknowledged the situation. She took a sip and said nothing about it. That, he thought, was either professionalism or a very high tolerance for disappointment. He showed her the scheduling system first, because it was the thing he was least ashamed of. It was a whiteboard on the wall behind the front counter, organized by day, with customers' names and the type of service written in different colors of marker. The system had made perfect sense to him when he'd invented it 3 years ago. Sloane studied it for about 90 seconds. "Who else reads this board?" she asked. "Me and Danny, my part-time guy. So there's no digital record. I've got a logbook. Can I see it?" He got the logbook from under the counter. It was a standard hardcover journal, the kind you bought at a drugstore, half filled with his handwriting. She turned through the pages without comment, her expression unchanging. Then she set it on the counter and looked at the invoices. He had not intended to show her the invoices. The invoices were his private shame. But she asked where he kept his billing records with the calm authority of someone who already knew the answer wasn't going to be organized. And something about her directness made it impossible to lie. He went to the back office and returned with the folder. The folder contained 43 invoices in no particular order, some of them marked paid, some of them not, some of them from jobs he'd completed 4 months ago. She sat down at the counter stool, pulled the folder toward her, and started going through them. She didn't make sounds of dismay. She didn't shake her head. She simply sorted, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, creating 3 separate stacks that she then began cross-referencing against the logbook. Landon stood behind the counter and watched her work. There was something about the way she did it that was different from how he expected someone to do it. Most people, when they looked at a mess, either looked overwhelmed or looked superior-like. The mess confirmed something they already suspected about the person who made it. Sloane looked at his invoices the way he looked at an engine, with interest, not judgment. Like she was trying to understand the system that had produced this result, rather than simply cataloging how bad the result was. After about 20 minutes, she said, without looking up, "Do you have your parts receipts?"
"In the box."
"Box, the blue one." He got the blue box. It was a plastic file box, and it contained 12 months of parts receipts in the order they'd been generated, which was to say, random. She worked for another 15 minutes. Then she set everything down and looked at him. "You want to know what I found?" "I have a feeling I don't," he said, "but yes. You have 11 invoices that were never sent. Combined value is around $4,200. You have 6 warranty reimbursements you qualified for and never filed. That's another $1,800. You've been undercharging for labor by about $12 an hour based on the current regional rate for independent shops, which, over the volume I'm seeing in this logbook, comes to." She paused. "Roughly $11,000 in lost revenue over the past 8 months. The number landed like something physical. Landon put both hands flat on the counter. 11,000. Approximately. I'd need to spend more time with the full records to be precise." He looked at the stacks she'd made. He looked at the blue box. He thought about the nights he'd stayed until 9 o'clock, wondering why the numbers never quite balanced. Why he kept feeling like he was working harder than the revenue reflected. Why the anxiety about money never fully left even during the good months. "I thought I was just bad at business," he said. "You're not bad at business," she said. "You're bad at administration. Those are different problems with different solutions." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know all this?" She hesitated, just barely a pause that most people wouldn't have caught. Then, "I've worked in operations, business development, process systems. I've spent a lot of time figuring out why organizations that should be profitable aren't. Where? Various places." She moved past it cleanly, efficiently, in a way that closed the question without making the closure obvious. Point is that the shop's fundamentals are solid. Your reputation in this area is good. I asked around before I came in. People trust your work. The problem is entirely operational, and you think you can fix the operational problem. I think I already identified more revenue loss in 40 minutes than you'd found in 8 months, she said. So yes. He almost smiled. It wasn't arrogance in her voice. It was just accuracy stated plainly, the way you'd state that a particular wrench was the right size for a particular bolt. Before he could respond, the back door opened. Caleb came in the way he always came in after school, let out backpack half open, jacket unzipped despite the cold, wearing the expression of a kid who had been sitting inside a building for 7 hours and needed about 12 minutes of open air before he could function as a human being again. He stopped when he saw Sloane. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. He looked at his father. "Who's that?" "This is Miss Kensington. She's here about a job." Caleb considered this with the frank appraisal that 9-year-olds applied to most situations. "What kind of job?" "Operations manager." "What does that mean?" "It means she helps run the business," Landon said. "Go put your bag in the office." Caleb went to the office, but did not. Apparently, stay there. Because 30 seconds later, he reappeared with his math homework and sat down at the end of the counter with the resigned posture of someone confronting an enemy they had been losing to for some time. Landon watched his son stare at the worksheet. He recognized that stare. It was the same stare he'd been seeing for 3 weeks, ever since fractions had entered the curriculum, and Caleb had decided, somewhere around the second day, that fractions were a personal affront. "I don't get it," Caleb announced to no one in particular. "Which part?" Sloane asked. Caleb looked up, slightly surprised she'd responded. "The denominator thing. Like, why does it matter what the bottom number is?" Sloane turned on her stool to face him. She didn't lean over his worksheet and start drawing on it. She didn't take the pencil out of his hand and demonstrate. She just looked at the paper from where she was and said, "If you cut a pizza into 4 slices and you eat one, what do you have left?" Caleb stared at her. 3 slices, right. And if you cut a different pizza into 8 slices and you eat one, do you have more pizza left or less? More. Because the slices are smaller. So the bottom number tells you how many pieces the whole thing was cut into. The bigger the bottom number, the smaller each piece is. She paused. "Does that help?" Caleb looked at his worksheet. He looked back at her. Something shifted in his face, not the sudden theatrical breakthrough of a cartoon character, but the smaller, quieter thing that happened when a concept that had been resistant suddenly gave a little. "Oh," he said. "Try the first problem," she said. He tried it. He got it right. He didn't announce this. He just flipped his pencil around, erased the wrong answer he'd had there, and wrote the right one. Then he moved to the second problem. Landon had been watching. He didn't say anything. What she'd done, the specific way she'd done it, was not what he expected. Most adults, when confronted with a struggling kid, either did the problem for them or launched into a full explanation that covered everything except the part the kid was actually confused about. She'd gone straight to the point of confusion and addressed only that. She hadn't made Caleb feel stupid. She hadn't made a production of helping him. She just answered the actual question. He turned back to Sloane. She was already looking at him, waiting. "When can you start?" he asked. Something in her expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile. More like the recognition that a decision had been made. "I'd need to know the compensation and the hours." He named a salary. It was fair, maybe a little better than fair, because he'd looked at the regional rates when he wrote the ad, and he wasn't interested in lowballing someone whose help he clearly needed. She didn't flinch at the number, didn't negotiate. "Hours? 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. Sometimes Saturday mornings when we're heavy. I'd want you on site most of the time. The operation needs someone physically present, not remote." She nodded slowly. "There's one thing." "Okay. I'm here because of what I can do," she said. Her voice was even without heat, but it was not negotiable. "Not because you need someone to fill a space in your life. I understand this is a small operation and things get personal in small operations. That's fine. But I'm an employee, and my value here is professional. If that ever gets confused, I'll say so, and I expect you to take it seriously when I do." He met her eyes. "Understood. Good." She straightened. "I can start Thursday." She started Thursday. By the end of the first week, Landon already knew he'd made the right call, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to where hiring decisions were concerned. His last hire, a mechanic named Brett, who'd seemed extremely capable during the interview, had lasted 6 days before it became apparent that Brett's capabilities were primarily theoretical. Sloane was not theoretical. She spent the first 2 days doing nothing but observing and asking questions. When parts were ordered, from which suppliers, at what markup, how jobs were scheduled relative to parts availability, how customer communications were handled, what happened when an appointment ran long. She didn't touch anything. She didn't suggest anything. She just watched and listened with the complete attention of someone building a map. On the third day, she made a list. The list was 2 pages, handwritten, organized into immediate actions and longer-term structural changes. She gave him a copy and walked him through it, item by item, not as a presentation, but as a conversation, asking whether he had objections, whether certain approaches fit how he wanted to run the shop, whether there were constraints she hadn't accounted for. He had 2 objections. She revised the plan on both points without arguing. By the end of the second week, she'd implemented a scheduling system that lived in software and on the whiteboard simultaneously, so Land could still glance up at the wall, but everything was backed up digitally. She'd filed 4 of the 6 overdue warranty claims. She'd sent invoices on 9 of the 11 outstanding accounts, with follow-up language that was firm but not aggressive. The kind of language that made it easy for people to pay without feeling accused. By the end of the first month, 3 of those accounts had paid in full. Landon found himself working differently than he had in years. Not harder. If anything, he was leaving an hour earlier because the administrative friction that had consumed so much of his mental energy was simply gone. It had been replaced by something that functioned. He didn't have to track every moving piece in his head anymore because there was a system that tracked them. He could be a mechanic. He could be good at his job. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that. There were things about Sloane that didn't quite add up, in the way that certain small mechanical anomalies don't quite add up. Not enough to indicate a serious problem, but enough that you noticed. She never talked about where she'd worked before. When he asked, she answered in general terms: operations, business development, process improvement, and then redirected. Her phone received a significant volume of calls, and she was professional about not taking them during working hours. But he could see from the number of notifications that piled up during the day that someone wanted her attention fairly urgently on a regular basis. She drove a car that was newer and cleaner than the vehicle of someone on an operations manager's salary should reasonably drive. Not flashy, just quietly, specifically nice, in the way that things were nice when quality had been the consideration rather than appearance. But she was competent, and she was honest, and she was steady. She showed up on time. She did what she said she'd do. She treated his customers like people and his employees like professionals and his son like someone whose problems were worth taking seriously. Whatever she wasn't telling him, he decided she was entitled to not tell. Everyone had private territory. He had his own. He knew better than most what it cost to have someone dig into it uninvited. So he let her have the afternoons she disappeared. For not disappeared exactly, but went quiet, went to her car with her phone, came back 20 minutes later with the composed expression of someone who had handled something difficult and wasn't going to make it anyone else's problem. He rearranged the schedule so her midday was lighter. He didn't mention he'd done it. She noticed anyway. She mentioned it once, briefly, and he shrugged and said the schedule had needed adjusting regardless, which wasn't entirely true. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to work. Caleb's attachment happened the way most real things happened. Not all at once, but in small accumulated increments that you didn't fully register until you looked back and realized how far you'd traveled from the starting point. Started with fractions and became other homework. Other homework became conversations about school, which were different with Sloane than with his father, because she asked different questions. Not how was your day, but specific things, like whether the science project topic he'd mentioned last week had worked out, or whether the kid in his class he'd described as annoying was still annoying or had improved. She remembered things. That was the part that got Caleb. Landon had noticed it in himself, too, though he hadn't named it. The way she paid attention to what you'd said 3 days ago and then circled back to it without making a thing of it, as if the information simply lived in her and was available when relevant. It was not a thing he'd experienced very often from another person. It was not a thing Caleb had experienced, he suspected, since before his mother had gone. Elena had died when Caleb was 4. A car accident, winter roads, 2 in the morning after a long hospital shift. Landon had spent the following year in a fog that he was not entirely sure had fully lifted even now, and in that fog he had kept the business running and kept Caleb fed and clothed and present at school, and he had done it all adequately. But adequately was not the same as well, and there were things he knew, in his quieter moments, that his son had not had enough of. He was watching Caleb laugh at something Sloane had said one afternoon, a real laugh, loose and uncontrived, the kind of laugh that required the body to be fully off guard, and he thought, that sound has been missing for a while. He couldn't say exactly how long. That was the thing about a gradual disappearance. You didn't notice it going. You only noticed sometimes when something returned. He went back to the engine he was working on. He did not examine the feeling further. He was not in the habit of examining feelings further. But it was there. He knew it was there. And outside, the October storm that had started the whole improbable thing finally stopped, and the sky over Cedar Ridge went the particular pale blue that Colorado produced after a hard rain, clean and cold, and so clear it almost hurt to look at it directly. And Pierce Auto Works was busy, for once, in all the ways that mattered. The 6-day waiting list didn't appear overnight. It built the way most real things built through accumulated small corrections, through systems replacing guesswork, through the specific satisfaction of a business finally operating at the level its quality had always deserved. By December, Pierce Auto Works had more scheduled appointments than it had available bays. By January, Danny had gone from part-time to full-time, and Landon had hired a second mechanic, a quiet and careful man named Marcus, who'd spent 12 years at a dealership and was tired of the quotas. By February, the whiteboard behind the counter had been supplemented by a tablet mounted to the wall that showed the week's schedule in color-coded blocks, and the blue plastic box of unsorted receipts had been replaced by a filing system that Sloane had built on a Saturday morning while Landon was under a customer's Jeep, and Caleb was supposedly doing homework, but was mostly asking her questions about why folders needed labels. Because, she'd said, not looking up from the folder she was making, if you can't find it, it might as well not exist. Caleb had thought about this. That's kind of like my room. I wasn't going to say that, but you were thinking it. She had paused, then said, I was thinking it a little. He'd grinned and gone back to his worksheet. She'd gone back to the folders. And Landon, under the Jeep 3 bays away, had listened to this exchange with the particular attention of a man hearing something he didn't have a name for yet. What Sloane had done to Pierce Auto Works was not magic. It wasn't even complicated, if you understood operations, and she clearly understood operations in a way that went beyond the general. Every decision she made was grounded, practical, scaled correctly to the size of the business. She didn't try to turn a 3-bay independent garage into a corporation. She tried to make it the best version of what it already was, and she was methodical about it, in a way that reminded Landon of the best mechanics he'd ever known. People who didn't guess, who diagnosed before they acted, who understood that the fastest way through a problem was usually the most careful one. She'd renegotiated the parts-supplier relationship first, because that was where the largest immediate margin improvement was available. She'd spent 2 weeks reviewing invoices from their primary supplier, identified 3 categories of parts where the shop was consistently paying above regional average, and called the supplier's account rep. Landon had not been present for that call, but he'd heard the tail end of it from the hallway, and what he'd heard was Sloane not aggressive, not apologetic, explaining, with the patience of someone who had done this before, exactly what the data showed and what adjustment she expected. They'd gotten the adjustment. How'd you know they'd move on price? He'd asked her afterward. Because they knew we'd looked at the numbers, she said. Suppliers don't lose accounts over a pricing conversation. They lose them over a pricing conversation where the customer has specifics. We had specifics. Where'd you learn that? The slight pause again. The fraction of a second hesitation he'd noticed before. Experience, she said, and picked up the phone to return a customer call. He filed it. He was getting good at filing things about Sloane into a mental folder he hadn't labeled yet. She'd updated the labor rate next, which had been the thing he'd been most resistant to. 11 years of charging a rate that felt fair had created a psychological attachment to the number, and he'd pushed back when she first suggested raising it. Our customers are used to what we charge, he'd said. Your customers are used to paying less than your work is worth, she said. Those are different problems. If we raise rates, we lose customers. Some. We might lose some. But look, she'd turned the tablet toward him, showing him the regional data she'd pulled. The shops with the strongest retention in this area are not the cheapest ones. They're the ones with the best reputations for quality and communication. You have the quality. We're working on the communication. If you raise your rate and your customers leave, that tells you they were price shoppers, not loyalty customers. And price shoppers aren't the ones keeping your lights on in February. He'd sat with that for 3 days. He'd thought about it while changing oil and while lying awake at 2 in the morning and while watching Caleb eat breakfast. Then he told her to make the change. The rate went up. They lost 2 accounts in the first month. They gained 5 new ones through referrals in the following 6 weeks, because the fleet of vehicles they were now maintaining looked good and ran well. And when people asked who did the work, Landon's name came up. Revenue for February was the highest single month in the shop's history. Landon had looked at the number for a long time. Then he'd walked out to where Sloane was working at the front counter and said, "I need to tell you something." She looked up. "I was wrong about the rate. You were right." She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't perform modesty either. She just said, "You weren't wrong to push back. You knew your customers and I didn't yet. Now we both know them better." And then she went back to what she was doing. That was the thing about her that he couldn't quite get used to. She was right fairly often, but she didn't seem to need him to acknowledge it in any particular way. She needed the business decision to go the right direction. That mattered to her visibly, in the focused way she approached every operational question. But his personal recognition of her correctness seemed to matter very little. She wasn't doing this to be right. She was doing it because the problem needed solving. He'd met very few people in his life who operated that way. His father had been one of them. Landon had not. Historically, been one of them himself, and the recognition was uncomfortable in the specific way that useful recognitions usually were. The afternoons continued. It happened most days between 12:30 and 1:15, sometimes shorter, sometimes running closer to 90 minutes, depending on what was happening. She would go quiet, check something on her phone, and then either step into the small office at the back or walk out to her car. Car was where she went when the calls were difficult. He could tell from the way she moved, not in any dramatic sense. She didn't stomp or slam, but there was a quality of deliberateness to how she walked on those days, like she was managing something carefully. He had arranged the schedule so that the early afternoon was her lightest period, and he'd done it without comment, and she had noticed without comment, and for about 3 weeks they had both behaved as though the arrangement had always been there. Then one afternoon in late January, he was out in the small lot behind the shop, replacing a headlight on his own truck, when he saw her through the car window. She was sitting very still with the phone held against her ear, and she wasn't speaking. She was listening, and whatever she was hearing had done something to her face that he hadn't seen before. Not distress, exactly, but the close, effortful expression of someone receiving information they needed to process in real time while keeping their voice professional. He didn't watch. He went back to the headlight. But he was aware, in the way you were aware of things you'd decided not to intrude on, that she was in there for a long time after the call ended, just sitting, not on her phone, not visibly doing anything. She came back inside 20 minutes later, poured herself a coffee, and returned to the quarterly tracking spreadsheet she'd been building. She didn't offer any explanation. He didn't ask for one. But that evening, while they were closing up and Caleb was in the office finishing a book report, Landon said, without looking up from the tool chest he was reorganizing,
"You doing okay?"
A pause. "Yes, you don't have to tell me anything," he said. "I'm not asking what's going on. I'm just asking if you're okay." She was quiet for a moment. He heard her set something down on the counter. "My father had an accident," she said, "about 4 months ago. He's in rehabilitation. It's a long process, and she paused. He has difficult days. I help manage some decisions around his care." Landon straightened up and turned around. She was standing at the counter with both hands flat on the surface, looking not at him but at the middle distance past his shoulder, in the way people looked when they were telling you something and didn't want to watch you receive it. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's a hard thing." "It is." She met his eyes briefly. "He's improving. Slowly. Is there anything that would help? With the schedule, I mean." "If you need more flexibility, you already gave me flexibility," she said. "I noticed. That was just... I know what it was." She picked up her jacket from the back of the stool. "Thank you, Landon." He nodded. She gathered her bag, said goodnight to Caleb, and left. And Landon stood in the quiet of the closed shop and thought about what it must cost her managing whatever was happening with her father. The difficult calls, the long silences in the car while still showing up every morning at 8 o'clock and doing the work with the consistent attention she'd brought from the first day. He thought about what that kind of compartmentalization required. He had some experience with it. He'd run a business and raised a child in the year after Elena died. He knew the specific exhaustion of being the person who kept going regardless, because stopping wasn't something you got to do. Turned off the lights and went to get his son. The fleet contract came into the picture in March. Roland Mercer arrived at Pierce Auto Works on a Thursday morning without an appointment, which was the first indication that he was a man accustomed to accommodations being made for him rather than the reverse. He was in his mid-50s, broad across the shoulders, wearing a jacket that cost more than Landon's monthly parts budget, and he had the specific confidence of someone who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for a long time. He wanted to talk about his company's vehicle fleet. 14 commercial vans, 3 pickup trucks, rotating maintenance schedule, potentially more vehicles if the arrangement worked out. His current provider had been inconsistent missed scheduled services, sloppy documentation, a warranty issue that had taken 3 months longer than it should have to resolve. Landon sat across from him at the counter and listened. He was aware, while listening, Sloane at the desk in the office doorway, not pretending to work but actually working, while also clearly tracking the conversation with the particular attention of someone who was already 3 steps ahead on what the numbers looked like. Roland was direct about what he needed and equally direct about what he expected: timeliness, documentation, a single point of contact, and pricing that reflected a volume relationship. "We can do all of that," Landon said. "I'd want to put together a formal proposal before we talk specific numbers. Give me a few days." Roland nodded, began to gather himself to leave, and then seemed to register Sloane for the first time. He glanced at her, then back at Landon, with the question implied rather than stated. "Sloane Kensington, operations manager," Landon said. "She'll be putting the proposal together." "Good," Roland said, in a tone that meant, "Fine, sure. Office support. Let's move on." What he did not know, and could not have known, was that Sloane had already looked up his company, estimated the annual vehicle maintenance cost, calculated the volume discount that would be competitive without compromising margin, identified 2 structural issues in how his current provider was handling his warranty claims, and drafted a rough framework for a service-level agreement in the notebook she kept beside her keyboard. She'd done this in the 40 minutes between his arrival and the point when he'd sat down. Landon met her eyes across the room briefly and looked away. Proposal took 3 days. She built it cleanly, specifically with supporting data for every pricing decision and a service schedule that was realistic. Not a salesperson's promise, but an operator's commitment. She included a section on documentation and communication protocols because she'd noticed that Roland's complaint about his previous provider was as much about transparency as quality. She showed it to Landon before it went out. He read it twice. "This is better than anything I've ever sent a client," he said. "You've never had anyone to write it for you before," she said. He looked at her. She was gathering the papers together without particular awareness that she'd said something worth marking. He thought about the $11,000 the shop had been losing annually before she arrived, and about the record February revenue, and about the parts supplier negotiation, and about Caleb's laugh coming back. He thought about what the shape of his life had been a year ago, and the shape it had now. He didn't say any of that. He said, "I'll call him to schedule the meeting." The meeting was set for the following Thursday afternoon. Sloane had prepared the room, which in practical terms meant she'd cleaned the front area, set up a fold-out table with 2 chairs across from a third, printed copies of the proposal with a cover page, and put coffee on that was actually drinkable, having quietly replaced the ancient canister of grounds he'd been using with something from the coffee shop 2 blocks over. Roland arrived on time, which upgraded Landon's opinion of him slightly. He sat down, accepted the proposal, and read it with a thoroughness that suggested he was a man who actually read documents rather than performing the reading of them. He had questions. Sloane answered most of them before Landon had finished forming his own response. Not because she was cutting anyone off. She read the rhythm of the conversation correctly and filled the spaces where the answer was operational rather than relational. Roland accepted the per-vehicle rate with 1 counter. He wanted a response time guarantee for breakdowns during business hours. Landon looked at his schedule, his bay capacity, Marcus's reliability. 4 hours, he said. Roland considered. 3 for the commercial vans. 3 for the vans if the issue is diagnosis and documentation, Landon said. If it needs a part I don't have on hand, 3 hours gets you a loaner and a timeline. Roland thought about it. Done, he said. He stood, shook Landon's hand. Then, and Landon would think about this moment later, think about how casually it was done, how complete the assumption was. Roland looked at Sloane with a kind of genial dismissal that was worse than rudeness because it was so unconscious. You can leave us to finalize the paperwork if you want, he said. We'll handle the rest. The room got very quiet. Not the dramatic quiet of a confrontation, but the specific stillness that occurred when something had been said that everyone in the room needed a moment to process. Landon looked at Roland. Then he looked at Sloane, who had not moved, whose expression had not changed except for something very small and very controlled happening around her eyes. He made the decision in about 2 seconds. Actually, Landon said, his voice level, the proposal you're holding was built by Sloane. The service level agreement, the pricing structure, the documentation protocol, that's her work. If we're finalizing anything, she's at the table for it. Roland blinked. I wasn't suggesting. I know, Landon said. That's how we operate here. A beat. Roland looked at Sloane, recalibrated, and nodded with the expression of a man adjusting to new information. Of course. The paperwork took 20 minutes. Roland signed, Landon signed, and when Roland left, he shook both their hands with equal formality. The fleet contract was real. It was done. After his car pulled out of the lot, Landon and Sloane stood on either side of the counter in the quiet of the closed-up front room. She was looking at the signed copy of the agreement in her hands, not quite smiling, but something adjacent to it, the look of a person registering that a thing they built had worked. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yeah, I did, he said. She looked up. You built the proposal, he said. You're the one who figured out what he actually needed, which was the documentation piece. If you're not at the table, I'm taking credit for your work. I'm not doing that. She was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable quiet, considering one. Most people would have let it go, she said. It's not a small account. You could have lost it. I know. You didn't think about that? I thought about it, he said. Then I thought about it differently. She looked at him for another second. Then she set the agreement down on the counter and said, I need to call the supplier to set up the account for the fleet billing.
Right.
She picked up her phone and went to the desk. Landon went back to the bay. But he was aware, in the particular way he'd become aware of her over months of proximity, that something had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in movies, but the way tectonic things shifted, underground and slow and significant. What happened next, he thought about later, was not something he planned. Caleb had started staying later at the shop after school. This was partly because his after-school program had shortened its hours in February, but mostly, Landon suspected, because he preferred the shop. He'd taken to sitting at the small desk in the corner of the front room with his homework, which had improved considerably since October. Not because school had gotten easier, but because the way he approached problems had changed. He asked different questions. He started from the thing he didn't understand, rather than trying to fake his way past it. Landon recognized this as Sloane's influence without being able to point to a specific conversation where it had happened. It was just there, distributed across 4 months of homework sessions and offhand exchanges in the particular quality of attention she paid when Caleb was talking, which was not the politely distracted attention of an adult tolerating a child's topic, but tension, the kind that required follow-up. She remembers stuff Caleb told his father one evening while Landon was making dinner. Like, I told her about the science fair thing back in November, and she asked about it in January. That's like 2 months later. She pays attention, Landon said. Yeah, but Caleb poked at the edge of his plate. Most people forget. Landon didn't have a good response to this because it was true, and the truth of it was the kind that pressed on things. He said, she's good at her job, which was accurate if insufficient. Caleb looked at him with the specific expression of a 9-year-old who suspected the adult was being evasive. Then he went back to eating. The arrival of spring brought the fleet contract into full operation, and Pierce Auto Workings entered the busiest period Landon had ever managed. 14 commercial vans on rotating maintenance was not a small thing. It required scheduling discipline, parts inventory management, documentation at every step, and the kind of communication with the client that Roland had made clear was non-negotiable. Sloane handled all of it. She built a fleet-specific tracking system that sat alongside the regular shop operations, with its own service history for each vehicle, its own reminder schedule, its own invoice template. She was on the phone with Roland's office manager twice a week and had managed, over 6 weeks, to turn a relationship that began as purely transactional into something closer to professional respect. The office manager sent a fruit basket in April. Landon did not know fruit baskets were still a thing that happened. But something else was happening that spring, slower and less measurable than revenue growth or scheduling efficiency, and Landon was aware of it the way he was aware of weather. Not always watching for it, but registering it in some peripheral way that meant it couldn't quite be ignored. He was looking for reasons to be in the same room as her. He didn't announce this to himself. He just noticed, after a while, that when he had a choice between handling something himself and bringing it to Sloane, he usually brought it to Sloane. That when she made a suggestion he didn't agree with, he enjoyed the conversation that followed, genuinely enjoyed it. Not in spite of the disagreement, but partly because of it. That when she laughed, which she did rarely and without announcement, it was generally at things that were actually funny, rather than things that were performing funniness, and the realness of it did something to the room. He also noticed that she kept herself at a specific distance. Not coldly. Sloane was not a cold person. He'd understood that from early on. But there was a perimeter she maintained, professional and court-like in its precision, and she returned to it after every moment of proximity with the reliability of water finding its level. He respected the perimeter. He also noticed it. She disappeared for longer than usual one afternoon in April, nearly 2 hours, which had never happened before. When she came back in, she was composed, but there was a quality to the composure that was different from her usual kind. Her usual composed was settled, neutral like still water. This was composed the way a surface was composed over something moving. She sat down at the desk, opened her laptop, and stared at the screen without typing. Landon finished what he was doing, told Marcus to handle the last oil change, washed his hands, and went to the front room. He made 2 coffees. He set one on the corner of her desk without comment. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "My father's having a harder week," she said. He sat down on the stool across from the counter, not leaning in, not crowding, just present. "I'm sorry." She stopped. Started again. He was an extraordinarily capable man. He built a very large enterprise from nothing. The idea of him. She stopped again. Her jaw tightened briefly. "The idea of him needing help," Landon said. "Yes," he nodded. "My dad was the same, not the same scale, obviously. But he built this shop, and he was the one people came to. When he got sick and he couldn't, he paused. It's a specific kind of hard thing to watch." She looked at him across the counter. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is." They were quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of 2 people who didn't know what to say, but the different kind, the kind that meant something had been understood without the imprecision of further words. "How much of the business is yours to manage?" he asked. Because it seemed like the question she might want asked, the one that let the conversation go somewhere practical rather than sitting in the difficult part. She paused slightly longer than the question required. "More than I expected," she said. "When he had the accident, decisions that had been his became unclear. In terms of responsibility. There are people who have their own ideas about how things should go, and some of them have been waiting for an opportunity to act on those ideas." She picked up the coffee. "Complicated. Is it something you can handle from here?" She looked at him with something very close to something she didn't let fully onto her face. So far, she said, he wanted to ask more. He was aware of how much he wanted to ask, and equally aware that she'd offered exactly as much as she was ready to offer, that pushing further would be the wrong move, that the distance she kept was hers to keep. "Okay," he said. He stood. "Flit vans 3 and 7 need their 60,000-mile service." Marcus started on 3. "You want to call Roland's manager and get that on the communication log today, or tomorrow's fine." She blinked once, as if returning from somewhere. "Today," she said. "I'll do it now. Take your time." He went back to the bay. She made the call. The afternoon moved on, and the shop moved with it, and the distance between them remained exactly what it had been. But that evening, when Landon was pulling out of the lot, he saw her sitting in her car in the last light of the April day, not on her phone, not doing anything, just sitting there with the window down in the cool air, her head resting against the seat, looking at the sky in the way that people looked at things when they needed to be somewhere without walls for a minute. He didn't stop. He drove home. made dinner, helped Caleb with a book report, and thought about the fact that she'd told him more today than she'd told him in 6 months. He thought about what that meant, and decided not to decide what it meant yet. He was a mechanic. He diagnosed before he acted. He didn't pretend to know what something was until he'd understood it. But he thought about her hands flat on the counter when she'd told him about her father back in January. He thought about the way she'd said, "Thank you, Landon," and picked up her jacket. He thought about the moment in the fleet meeting when Roland had suggested she leave and Landon had said no, and the way she had looked at him afterward. Not grateful, exactly, but something more complicated than grateful, something that seemed to be doing its own accounting. He thought about Caleb asking she remembers stuff. Most people forget. He put Caleb to bed, cleaned up the kitchen, and went to bed himself. He lay there for a while in the dark of the Colorado spring, with the window cracked and the sound of the neighborhood outside. And he thought, I don't know what she's not telling me. But whatever it is, she's still here every morning at 8 o'clock. That was, he decided, enough to go on. He turned over and went to sleep. Spring in Cedar Ridge ran long that year, the cold holding on through April and releasing only grudgingly into May, and the shop ran the way Landon had stopped believing it could run steadily. Predictably, with the particular rhythm of an operation that had found its footing. The fleet contract with Roland Mercer's company had settled into routine. Marcus had become reliable enough that Landon could leave the bay for an hour without everything quietly falling apart. Day's waiting list had extended to 8. A woman from the Cedar Ridge Gazette had called asking if she could write a short piece on independent auto shops surviving in the age of dealership service centers, and Sloane had spent 40 minutes with her on the phone, and the resulting article had included 3 sentences from Landon, and a photograph of the shop's front that made it look, somehow, better than Landon knew it actually looked. He had not asked Sloane how she'd managed that. He'd learned over 7 months that there were things she managed well, and that asking for detailed accounting of every one of them was both unnecessary and faintly insulting. She knew what she was doing. He trusted what she was doing. Those 2 facts had simplified his life considerably. What had not simplified was everything else. He was aware of her now, in the way that you became aware of something that had been part of your daily landscape for long enough to stop being background and become foreground, not because it had changed, but because you had. He noticed the specific quality of her attention when he was explaining a mechanical problem to a customer, the way she listened without intervening, and he noticed when she did intervene, which was always exactly at the point where the conversation was about to lose the customer's confidence. He noticed that she drank her coffee in 3 stages and always let the last inch go cold. He noticed that she was genuinely funny in a dry, low-key way that required you to be paying attention to catch, and that the humor appeared without announcement and departed the same way. He also noticed, with the methodical honesty he applied to engine problems, that he was inventing reasons to be near her, and that this was probably a thing he needed to look at directly before it became a thing he couldn't look at directly. He was still in the early stages of looking at it directly when she brought the problem to him first. It was a Wednesday morning in early May, slow by the shop's new standards, only 3 vehicles in. Marcus handling 2 of them, Danny doing an inspection on the 3rd. Sloane was at the front desk with her laptop and her second coffee and a phone that had been receiving an unusual volume of calls since Monday. Landon had noticed the volume. He'd also noticed that she was answering some of them outside. He came in from the bay to get a wrench from the wall rack and found her standing at the counter with her phone face down and an expression he hadn't seen before. Not distress, she was too controlled for anything that uncurated. But the composure was working harder than usual. "You okay?" he said. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "When you have time." "I have time now." She looked around the shop, Danny in the far bay, Marcus visible through the glass on the lift. No customers at the counter. "Okay," she said. "Okay." He leaned against the counter. She turned to face him and crossed her arms. Not defensively, but the way people crossed their arms when they were about to say something uncomfortable and needed something to hold on to while they said it. "Last month, she started. With Roland Mercer. When he told me I could leave the room. Yeah, and you said no. I remember." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciated it. I want to be clear about that. I appreciated it. But there's something about how it happened that I've been sitting with, and I think I need to say it." He waited. "You made the decision to include me," she said, "which sounds right. But the decision about whether I stay in a room shouldn't be yours to make. It should be mine." She paused. When you told him I was staying, I wasn't asked. You spoke for me. And I know that came from a good place. And the outcome was correct. And Roland backed down. The mechanism, she stopped. Does that make sense? He started to say something. Stopped. You had the right instinct, she said. But there's a difference between having my back and deciding for me. I've had a lot of people in my life who were very certain they were protecting me when what they were actually doing was making choices about my circumstances without consulting me, even when the choice was in my favor, even when I would have made the same choice myself. She uncrossed her arms. I'm not accusing you of bad intentions. I'm telling you that the pattern itself is the problem, regardless of intention. Landon was quiet for a moment. He thought about his first instinct, which was to explain himself to point out that there hadn't been time to confer, that Roland was already moving, that the decision had needed to be made in the moment, and he'd made it in her favor. He could feel the explanation ready in his throat, detailed and reasonable, and he understood that deploying it would be the wrong move. Not because it was untrue, because the point wasn't whether his reasoning was sound. Point was what she'd actually said. You're right, he said. She blinked, slightly, as if she'd been prepared for a longer conversation. I should have looked at you first, he said, or said something like, Sloane, do you want to handle this? And let you decide. I didn't do that, I just acted. He paused, I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment, not a long moment, but it was the look of someone recalibrating, very slightly, and the recalibration went somewhere in her expression that he caught before it was gone. That's it, she said. You're not going to explain why it made sense in the moment. It did make sense in the moment, he said. That doesn't mean it was right. She was quiet. I'll do better, he said. She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. It was probably already at the cold inch stage, he thought, and set it back down. Thank you, she said. And it was the same two-word thing she'd said the night she'd told him about her father, the same weight in it. He went back to the bay. He worked on the exhaust system he'd been rebuilding and thought about what she'd said and the specific accuracy of it, and he thought about Elena not in the grief way, but in the accounting way, the way you look back at a relationship honestly when enough time had passed. He thought about the number of times he'd made decisions in Elena's favor without asking, and how she'd been patient about it, and how that patience had maybe been a problem of its own. He thought about the fact that Sloane had said the thing directly instead of being patient about it. He thought that was better, even though it had been uncomfortable to hear. The following 2 weeks were, by external measure, the best 2 weeks Pierce Auto Works had experienced in its history. Revenue was up. The fleet contract was generating consistent referrals. 2 of Roland Mercer's business associates had called asking about service. Marcus had turned out to have a specific gift for electrical diagnostics that was increasingly valuable, as more vehicles came in with software issues, and Landon had given him a raise and a more formal role, which Marcus had accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who was used to being undervalued. And Landon and Sloane had shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing between them operated dramatically. But the conversation about Roland Mercer had moved something, the way a correctly tightened bolt moved something in an engine. Not the dramatic change of replacing a part, but the functional change of alignment. He asked her things now that he had previously decided without asking. She offered things that she had previously kept within her professional perimeter. The distance was still there, but it was a different kind of distanceless maintained, more natural. Caleb noticed before either of them would have admitted there was anything to notice. Is Sloane coming to my game? He asked one Saturday morning in late May. His school had a spring field day that was loosely organized around various outdoor events, and Caleb had, for reasons not entirely clear to Landon, become invested in a relay race involving something with a beanbag. It's a work day, Landon said. It's Saturday. We're open Saturday mornings. Caleb considered this. Could you ask her? I'm not going to ask her to come to your field day, bud. Why not? Because she's an employee, not. He stopped. Caleb looked at him with the expression of a 9-year-old who had just watched an adult fail to finish a sentence and understood exactly why. Not what? It's a work day, Landon said again, which wasn't an answer to the question Caleb had actually asked. Caleb let it go. But he asked Sloane himself the following Monday, with the directness of a child who had not yet fully learned the adult habit of not saying the thing you mean. He walked up to her desk, dropped his backpack, and said, I have a relay race on Saturday. Will you come? Sloane looked at him. She looked at Landon across the room. Landon looked at a spot on the wall. What time? She said. 10. We open at 8, she said. I can probably leave by 9:30. Caleb's face did what it did when something he'd wanted happened. Not an explosion of excitement, but a kind of quiet settling, like a room coming into focus. Okay, he said, and went to get his homework out. Landon, without looking at Sloane, picked up a clipboard and went to check inventory. She came to the field day. She stood on the edge of the grass with her jacket and her coffee from the place 2 blocks over she had, at some point in the past month, started bringing him one too, which had become a thing that neither of them had discussed. And she watched Caleb's relay race with the attentiveness of someone for whom this was the primary thing happening, not a side errand. Caleb's team came in second. He was fine with it, which surprised Landon, who remembered his son at 7 losing a board game and requiring 20 minutes of recalibration. He walked over to them afterward with dirt on his knees and said, "The other kid was just faster. It's not like I didn't run hard." "You ran hard," Sloane said. "I know." He took the water bottle Landon offered. "Still getting pizza?" "Yes," Landon said. They got pizza. All 3 of them, at the place on Elm that had been there since Landon was in high school, in a booth by the window while the Saturday traffic moved outside. Caleb ate 3 slices and told an involved story about a substitute teacher who had, apparently, attempted to teach long division using a method that no one in the class had been able to follow, including the most mathematically confident kid, who had told the substitute teacher so. "What did the teacher say?" Sloane asked. "He said it was the right method and maybe we should try harder." Caleb took a drink of his soda, but it wasn't the right method. It was just a method. Sloane looked at him with something close to admiration. "Did you say that?" "No," Caleb said. "I wrote it down and showed my dad." Landon snorted. He hadn't meant to. It came out and Sloane looked at him, and one corner of her mouth went up, and then Caleb started laughing because his father was laughing. And for about 45 seconds, the 3 of them were laughing in a pizza booth on a Saturday afternoon about a substitute teacher none of them had met, and it was easy in the way that very few things were easy anymore. Then it was over, and they ate the rest of the pizza, and Sloane drove back to the shop to finish 2 hours she'd said she'd cover, and Landon drove Caleb home and tried not to think too clearly about the fact that the afternoon had felt like something it wasn't, and probably shouldn't be, and that he was losing ground on both fronts. They came on a Thursday. Landon saw the car first, a black SUV, not the kind you rented at the airport, but the kind that arrived with purpose, followed by a second one. Parking in front of Pierce Auto Works at 10:15 in the morning, with the specific precision of vehicles that had been told where to be and had arrived there. He was in the front room getting a customer's keys when the door opened. 2 men in suits came in. Behind them, a third older, carrying a leather portfolio, with the expression of someone who had been sent to handle something that required handling. Landon looked at them. He didn't know any of them. "Can I help you?" he said. The older man looked past him. "We're here for Miss Kensington," he said. The room shifted. Landon was not sure, later, how to describe it, not literally, but in the way that the quality of a moment shifted when something was about to happen that you didn't have context for yet. Turned. Sloane was standing in the doorway of the back office. She had heard the car, he would understand this later. Looking back, she had known something was coming for a while, maybe days, maybe longer. She was composed, but it was the working hard kind of composed, the kind from the April afternoon when she'd been sitting in her car in the last light looking at the sky. "Victor," she said. "Miss Kensington." The older man's voice was professionally warm. "I apologize for coming in person. You haven't been returning calls." "I return the calls I choose to return." "The board requests what's in your presence at headquarters," he said. "There are decisions that require the authority of the principal shareholder and cannot be delayed further." The shop had gone very quiet. Marcus was visible through the bay window, not pretending to work. Danny had stopped moving. The customer whose keys Landon was holding seemed to have stopped breathing. Landon looked at Sloane. She was looking at Victor, and there was something in her eyes that was neither fear nor surprise, but the specific expression of someone watching an inevitability arrive on schedule. "This is not the place," she said, her voice low and precise. "Miss Kensington?" "I said this is not the place, Victor." The calm in her voice had an edge now, not raised but sharpened. "Give me 10 minutes." Victor looked at the 2 men beside him. He looked at the shop, the bays, the tools, the lift, the whiteboard with the color-coded schedule, the tablet on the wall. He looked at Landon with the expression of a man trying to reconcile something that didn't fit the picture he'd arrived with. Of course, he said. Sloane looked at Landon. Can I use the office? It's yours, he said. She went into the back. The three men waited by the door. Landon gave the customer his keys, said something about the service that he couldn't fully recall afterward, and watched the man leave quickly, as people did when they sensed a room was about to contain something large. Sloane was in the office for 11 minutes. When she came out, the composure had settled into something different, harder, more deliberate, the composure of a decision rather than a maintenance. She looked at Victor. I'll call you this afternoon, she said, with a time for a formal meeting. Not before then. The board reports to me, she said, quietly, flatly, like something being read from a page of settled fact. Victor closed his mouth. He nodded. He and the two men left. The SUVs pulled away. The shop was very quiet. Sloane stood in the middle of the front room and looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked up at Landon. He had 1,000 things he could have said. He said the only one that mattered. Who are you? She let out a breath. Not quite a sigh, something shorter than that. Compressed, like releasing pressure from a valve. I should have told you before now, she said. Sloane Kensington, she said. My name is Sloane Kensington. My family, my father built Kensington Dominion Holdings. Investment, real estate, logistics, a few manufacturing interests. Privately held. The principal shareholder is my father, and since his accident, executive authority has effectively passed to me. She paused. Company's assets are around $14 billion. The number was so large that it didn't land immediately as a number. It landed as a shape, something vast and without clear edges, like a weather system viewed from the ground. Landon stood very still. The men who just left, she continued, work for the company. The board has been pushing for decisions I've been deferring. There are people who would like to use my father's incapacitation to restructure the executive hierarchy. I've been managing that from here, because I can manage it from here, but they've run out of patience. You're a billionaire, he said. Yes. You answered an ad, he said. For an operations manager. Yes, in my garage. Yes. He turned and walked to the far side of the room. He stood there with his back to her for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at the tool wall without seeing it. Then he turned back. Was any of it real? He said. The work, the invoices. He stopped. Was this some kind of, he searched for the word. Experiment, a project? No. Her voice was immediate. Landon, no. Because from where I'm standing. I know where you're standing, she said. She took a step toward him, not closing the distance entirely but shortening it. I know exactly how this looks, and I know I don't have the right to tell you how to feel about it. But I need you to let me explain, and then you can feel however you feel. He looked at her. He nodded. Once. She pulled out the stool from behind the counter and sat down. Not performing, not calculating, just sitting the way someone sat when they were tired of the particular effort they'd been making for a long time and had permission to stop. I have spent 6 years in a world where every conversation has a subtext, she said, where people agree with me because of who I am rather than because I'm right, where I have never been certain, not once in 6 years, whether a professional relationship was genuine or strategic, where my father's name preceded me into every room and answered questions before I could open my mouth. She looked at her hands. I'm good at what I do. I've always believed that. But I couldn't prove it, not in any way that felt real, because the conditions were never real. The money was always there, underneath everything, making it impossible to know. Landon didn't say anything. I found your ad in October, she said. I'd been looking, not consciously, but looking, for somewhere I could work without anyone knowing my name. I thought it would be temporary. I thought maybe a month. She stopped. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't plan what the shop would become or what would happen with Caleb or... She stopped again. Or what, he said. She looked at him directly. I didn't plan any of the things that made leaving feel like a cost. He held her gaze. Then he looked away. The work was real, she said. Every invoice I recovered, every conversation with Roland, every Saturday morning with those folders, that was real work, Landon. I didn't bring resources you don't know about. I didn't make calls to people who owed my family favors. Everything this shop gained in 8 months, it gained because the work deserved it. He was quiet for a long moment. That's true, he said. I know it's true. Then what's the question, she said. Not combative, genuine. The question, he said, is whether I ever actually knew you. or whether I knew the version of you that needed something from me that you can't get from your own life. He paused. Because that's a different thing. She didn't flinch from this. She considers it with the same steadiness she applied to operational problems, looking at it directly, without softening it. Both things can be true, she said slowly. I needed something I couldn't get inside my own world. And the person you know, the work, the way I think, the things I care about, that's real. Those aren't different women. They're the same one. She paused. I hid my circumstances. I didn't hide myself. He sat down on the stool behind the counter. He looked at the tablet on the wall, the scheduling system she'd built, the color-coded blocks, the service history protocol she'd spent 3 evenings setting up. He thought about the folder system and the parts supplier negotiation and the fleet proposal and the fruit basket from Roland's office manager and the Saturday at the field day, and Caleb saying she remembers stuff most people forget. I'm not angry that you have money, he said. I know. I'm angry that you were making decisions about what I got to know, he said. About my own life, about who I was inviting in. She was quiet. You told me back in October, he said, day one. You told me your value here was professional, and if it got confused, you'd say so. And I took that seriously. He met her eyes. But you were confused about something too, and you didn't say so. She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it. Not defensively, not looking for the counter-argument, just sitting with it the way she'd sat with difficult things before. Yes, she said. You're right, I need to... He stopped. I need to think about this. Okay, not because I'm deciding anything about the shop or about... He stopped again. I just need to think. I'll give you whatever space you need, she said. He stood up and went back to the bay. He picked up a wrench and set it back down. He stood at the lift, with his hands on the frame of a vehicle that was up on it, and looked at the undercarriage without seeing it. From the front room, he could hear Sloane on the phone, Victor, probably, the conversation she'd promised. Her voice was professional, and even, which was the thing about her that was most confusing in this moment, she had just told him she was worth $14 billion, and she had told a man in a suit that he could wait until this afternoon, and now she was making the call she'd said she'd make, and she sounded exactly like herself. That was the thing, he thought. She sounded exactly like herself. He'd known her for 8 months. He'd watched her work. He'd watched her with his son. He'd watched her sit in her car in the April light with her head against the seat because her father was having a hard week. He'd watched her tell him, in this same room, that protecting her was not the same as respecting her. She'd told him the truth about who she was the minute the truth was forced into the room. She'd told it without deflection or performance. She'd sat on the stool and looked tired and said, I hid my circumstances. I didn't hide myself. He didn't know what that meant yet, fully. He didn't know what the board's ultimatum meant, or what it would mean for the shop, or whether she would stay or go, or whether the life he'd been constructing in his peripheral vision over the past 8 months, the one where the afternoon pizza and the coffee and the field day were not one-time things, was real or imagined. But he thought about what she'd asked him that first day, when she'd established the boundary that had made him hire her. She'd said, I'm here because of what I can do. And everything she'd done since then had been exactly that. He was still standing at the lift when Caleb came in from school, dropped his bag on the desk, and went straight to the front room. Landon heard them, a brief exchange, Caleb asking something, Sloane answering, the particular tone they had with each other that was separate from anything involving Landon. He went to the doorway. Caleb was at his homework. Sloane was at the desk, phone face down, looking at her laptop screen. Neither of them was making a performance of normalcy. It just was normal, in the specific way that things were normal when they'd had enough time to settle into place. His son, the billionaire who'd reorganized his parts filing system on a Saturday morning and argued with him about labor rates and come to a school field day and remembered the name of the kid who was still annoying. Landon went back to the bay. He worked until 6. Caleb fell asleep in the office chair. Sloane, without being asked, turned off her laptop, put her jacket on, and said good night. She was at the door when he said, same time tomorrow? She turned. 8 o'clock, he said, schedule's full. She held his gaze. 8 o'clock, she said. She left. He woke Caleb, got their things, and locked up the shop, and the evening was cool and smelled like the mountain air that came down into Cedar Ridge after a clear day, and everything was still unresolved, and probably would be for a while, and he drove home anyway. She was there at 8 o'clock. Landon was already in the bay, when he heard her car pull in the specific sound of that engine, which he now recognized the way you recognize the sound of something that had become part of your daily landscape without you deciding it would. He heard the door, heard her set her bag down, heard the particular sequence of sounds that meant she was starting the coffee and opening her laptop and doing the first 10 minutes of her morning the way she always did them. He didn't go to the front room. He worked on the transmission he'd been rebuilding, and the morning moved the way mornings moved in the shop now, with structure, with rhythm, with the background hum of an operation that knew what it was doing. At 9, she brought him a coffee without comment and went back to the front. He held the cup and thought about what that meant, which was probably the same thing it had always meant, which was that she was a person who paid attention to what people needed without making a production of it. And the fact that she was worth $14 billion did not change the coffee or the attention or the lack of production. He was aware that he was not as angry as he'd expected to be when he went home the previous night. He'd driven home ready for the anger to settle in properly, ready to examine the full shape of what she'd withheld and feel appropriately wronged by it. Instead, what settled in was something more complicated and less satisfying, the understanding that he could not honestly assess her choices without also assessing his own. He had known for months that she was carrying something significant. He had arranged her schedule around it, made space for it, treated it with the care you gave private things. He had chosen, deliberately, not to push. He couldn't be angry that she'd kept a secret, and simultaneously proud of himself for not demanding it. They worked through the morning without addressing anything. This was not avoidance. It was the pragmatic recognition that the shop had 3 vehicles due out by noon, and the conversation they needed to have required more than the 20-minute windows that appeared between appointments. Sloane handled the front with the same competence she handled every morning. Marcus finished an electrical diagnostic on a Subaru. Danny rotated tires on a customer's minivan and managed to over-torque one lug nut, which Landon fixed without significant comment because it was Danny's one consistent flaw and yelling about it had never once produced improvement. 12:15, with the last morning customer gone and Marcus on his lunch break, Landon came to the front room and sat down across the counter from Sloane. She looked up from her laptop. "I want to understand the situation with the board," he said, "if you're willing to explain it." She closed the laptop. "Yes," she said. "Okay." She explained it the way she explained operational problems specifically, without unnecessary preamble. Her father, Harrison Kensington, had built the investment holding company across 30 years, taking it from a regional real estate concern to a diversified private entity with interests in 6 industries across 4 states. He had run it with a centralized authority structure that worked because Harrison Kensington was a specific kind of man, decisive, detail-oriented, trusted by the people who worked for him because he was consistent. When his accident had removed him from active management, the company had continued operating under the authority structure he'd designed, which meant authority had concentrated in Sloane as the next-in-line controlling shareholder. The problem was that several members of the board had been waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for an opportunity to introduce a different structure, one that distributed executive power across a committee rather than concentrating it in a single person. This was framed as modernization. It was also, Sloane said without apparent bitterness, a mechanism which certain board members would gain substantially more individual influence. "They've been maneuvering for 3 months, she said, using my father's incapacitation and my absence from headquarters as evidence that the current structure is unstable. The argument is that a controlling shareholder who isn't physically present at the company is a liability." "Is there anything to that argument?" Landon asked. She looked at him. "That's a very direct question. I'm trying to understand the situation, not take your side reflexively." She seemed to appreciate this, or at least to recognize it. "There is something to it," she said. "I've been managing remotely, which is workable but not ideal. There are decisions I've deferred that shouldn't have been deferred." And she paused. "My father's structure was designed around his presence. It was never fully designed for a transition. He didn't plan to be incapacitated. So what does the board want, specifically?" "They want me to return to the headquarters in Denver and take formal executive control, visibly physically on site." She looked at her hands. "If I don't, there's a shareholder meeting scheduled for July where a structural vote could remove the concentrated executive authority from the principal shareholder's position entirely, meaning they'd remove your control, meaning they'd dilute it past the point of effectiveness." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. What do you want to do? She was quiet. That's the question you're not answering, he said. Not to the board, to yourself. She stood up and walked to the window, the one that faced the lot, the one with the cedar tree at the edge of the property that had been there since before the shop existed. She stood there with her arms crossed, not the defensive crossing, but the holding onto something crossing. I want to prove that both things are possible, she said. That's what I want. I want to run the company without the company being the only thing I am. My father ran it for 30 years and it consumed him. He was brilliant and capable, and he had almost nothing outside of it. I used to think that was just how it worked, that the price of building something was giving it everything. She paused. I don't believe that anymore. Because of being here? She turned from the window. Because of being here, she said. Because of what this she gestured, a general gesture that took in the shop, the schedule tablet, the front counter, all of it showed me. This shop was losing money and performing below its potential, not because the work was bad, but because there was no structure supporting the work. I fixed the structure. The work was already good. It didn't need to be replaced. It needed to be supported. She looked at him. That's what Kensington Dominion needs. Not a new ownership philosophy. A management structure that doesn't require me to be physically inside it every day to function. Can you build that? Yes, she said without hesitation. Then I think so. I've been thinking about how for 2 months. So the answer to the board's ultimatum is to restructure before the July meeting. Yes. If I can do it in 6 weeks, which is she stopped. Aggressive. What does aggressive mean in practical terms? It means appointing a coup I trust with enough authority to make daily operational decisions, restructuring 2 board committees that currently require my signature on things that don't require my signature, and establishing a reporting framework that lets me be a controlling owner without being a full-time executive. She looked at him. It's not complicated in concept. It's difficult in execution, because every structural change I make will be read as weakness or confusion by people who are looking for evidence of both. So you have to do it confidently and quickly. Yes. He considered this. You've already figured most of this out. I've been figuring it out from here, she said. For 2 months. The afternoon calls. Some of them were lawyers. Some were my father's most trusted senior staff. I've been building a picture of what needs to change. He let that sit for a moment. Why didn't you go back when the accident happened? In October, when you started here, you already knew about the accident. Because I knew if I walked back in immediately, the board would read it as crisis management, as confirmation that the structure couldn't function without my physical presence. She paused. And because I wasn't ready. For the company? For going back to being only that. The honesty of it was quiet and arrived without drama, and it was the most direct thing she'd said in all the months he'd known her. More direct than the conversation about Roland. More direct than the explanation she'd given yesterday. He understood, in the way he sometimes understood things with engines, before he could explain the diagnosis, that this was the real center of it, not the board, not the structure, not the $14 billion. This was the thing underneath all of it. I need to go back to Denver, she said. Not permanently, but I need to be there to do this right, and it will take probably 6 weeks of intensive work. She met his eyes. I wanted to tell you before I made any decisions about timing. Why? She looked at him with the expression of someone who had an answer they were examining for accuracy before saying it. Because this isn't only my life anymore, she said. And I wanted to be clear about that to myself before I made any decisions. He understood what she was saying and chose not to respond to it directly, because responding to it directly would have required him to say something he hadn't yet fully composed. And he was not a man who said things he hadn't fully composed. When do you need to leave? I'd like to finish the week, she said. Train whoever you want on the fleet documentation system. Make sure the May billing cycle is complete. I don't need to be trained, he said. I need to understand the fleet system well enough to manage it. Marcus can handle the documentation if I show him the protocol. I'll leave everything documented, she said. Every system, every process, every point of contact. I know you will. He stood. Take what you need to do this right. The shop will be here. She looked at him for a moment, just looked, without the professional composure and without the careful distance. Just a person looking at another person across a counter in a garage in Colorado. Okay, she said. He went back to the bay. He had 3 more hours of work on the transmission, and he did all of it, and the afternoon passed, and Caleb came in from school, and the day closed the way days closed. He did not tell Caleb that evening. He needed to be clearer himself before he could be clear for his son. The week was ordinary and not ordinary. Sloane documented everything. She had always been thorough, but this was a different quality of thoroughness, the kind that came with the knowledge that you were leaving something in someone else's hands and needed to do it right. She created instruction sets for the scheduling system, the fleet tracking, the billing cycle, the parts inventory protocol, the warranty claim process. She wrote them in plain language, without jargon, with specific examples for the points most likely to cause confusion. She walked Landon through each one, and she walked Marcus through the fleet documentation, and she spent 2 mornings on the phone with Roland Mercer's office manager, establishing a direct line for fleet communications that didn't require routing through her. She was efficient about all of it, and she did not make it emotional, and Landon matched her register because that seemed like what the situation required. On Thursday evening, Caleb was doing homework at the desk in the corner, when Sloane sat down beside him and looked at his worksheet, a reading comprehension exercise, which Caleb had opinions about. Always the same, Caleb said. Read the paragraph, answer the questions about the paragraph, but the questions are always asking about stuff that's right there in the paragraph. There's no thinking. What kind of thinking do you want? Sloane asked. Like, why did the person do the thing? Not what did they do. Why? She was quiet for a moment. That's a good distinction, she said. My teacher says I need to answer what's there, not what I think. Your teacher's right about tests, she said. But you're right about life. Caleb looked at her. He was 9, but he was a 9-year-old who paid close attention to adults, and he had the specific sensitivity of a child who had learned early that things could change without warning. Are you going somewhere? He said. A pause. Sloane looked at Landon across the room. Landon set down the clipboard he was holding. I need to go to Denver for a while, Sloane said, to take care of some things with my family's business. Caleb was quiet for a moment. For how long? About 6 weeks, I think. Are you coming back? The question was simple and direct and went straight into the center of things, the way children's questions did, without the adult architecture of qualification and context. I plan to, she said. That's not the same as yes, Caleb said. She looked at him steadily. No, she said, it's not. I can't promise you exactly how things will work out, but I can tell you that what's here is important to me, and that I'm not going to Denver because I want to leave. She paused. I'm going because there's something I need to fix, and fixing it is what makes staying possible. Caleb considered this for a long moment, like when Dad has to fix a car before he can come home, he said. Landon looked at his son. Yeah, Sloane said. Like that. Caleb nodded slowly, in the way he nodded when he had accepted a thing that he didn't particularly like. He went back to his worksheet. Sloane sat with him for another 20 minutes, until he'd finished it, and then she gathered her things. At the door, Landon said Sloane. She turned. He had composed it now, or enough of it. I'm not going to ask you to stay, and I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter whether you come back. Both of those things would be dishonest. He met her eyes. But whatever you decide needs to be your decision. Not because of Caleb or because of this place or because of anything that pulls at you from this direction. If you come back, it needs to be because you chose it, not because something here made leaving feel impossible. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. Okay, he said. Landon, she stopped. Then what's here? She stopped again, and he watched her do it. Watched her get to the edge of something and hold there, composure and honesty pulling in different directions. I know, he said gently. I know what you're trying to say. She nodded once. She left. Denver was not a small undertaking. She arrived on a Monday morning and walked into the Kensington Dominion headquarters for the first time in 8 months, and the reception she received was the specific mixture of relief and wariness that characterized rooms where power had been in question. Victor met her at the elevator, with the portfolio she recognized from the garage visit and an expression of professional neutrality that she understood to mean he had been doing his best to keep things stable and was cautiously optimistic about her presence. She spent the first day reading. Not performing activity, not taking meetings, not reasserting visibility, just sitting in the executive office with 12 weeks of board minutes, operational reports, financial summaries, and correspondence. Reading everything with the attention she'd applied to Landon's invoices on that first day in October. Looking for what was missing. Looking for where the losses were. The losses, it turned out, were structural rather than financial. The company was profitable. Her father had built it to be profitable through multiple cycles, and the fundamentals were sound. What had deteriorated was decision velocity. Without a clear executive authority present, decisions that required a sign-off had been queuing, some for weeks, some for longer. The organization had compensated by becoming careful to the point of paralysis on anything above a certain dollar threshold. On the second day, she took meetings. She met with Victor first because he was competent, and she trusted him, and she needed to understand the board landscape from someone who had been inside it for the past 8 months. 3 board members are aligned in the restructuring position, Victor said. Hargrove, Park, and Delaney. Hargrove is the driver. He's been collecting support for the committee model since February. Hargrove's been on the board for 11 years, she said. He's never been comfortable with the principal shareholder structure. He's been waiting for an opening. Did he create one or find one? Victor's expression shifted very slightly. I believe he found one, he said, and made the most of it. Okay. She looked at the board composition list on the table. Who's persuadable? Rawlings, possibly. Brennan, if she's convinced the committee model creates more risk than it resolves. Chen is your strongest ally. She's been pushing back on Hargrove consistently. Set up individual meetings with all 5. Rawlings and Brennan first. She closed the folder. And I want to meet with the senior operations team. Not as a group individually. I want to know what's actually been happening at the operational level, not the board version. That will take time. I have 6 weeks, she said. We're starting today. The work was not unfamiliar to her. She had grown up adjacent to it, had been formally involved for 6 years, and understood the specific grammar of corporate governance in a family-held company. What was different now was how she approached it. She'd spent 8 months building a filing system with cardboard folders and reorganizing a parts-supplier relationship over 3 weeks of careful invoice analysis. The scale was different. The principle was identical. She identified the operational decisions that had been stalled and cleared them in batches, sorting by risk level and impact, delegating the lower threshold ones to existing staff with authority she formalized in writing. She identified the 3 committee structures that Hargrove's model would have absorbed and restructured them before the board could act, making the changes on her own authority, documented and notified, which was within the principal shareholder's power, and demonstrated that she did not need the board's proposed model to make the organization more functional. She met with Hargrove himself on the Thursday of the first week. He was a man in his late 60s who had spent his career being the most experienced person in most rooms, and he had the specific quality of someone who considered patience a form of strategy. He sat across from her in the conference room with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the long game was going his way. I appreciate you returning, he said. I appreciate the board's consistency, she said, which was not a compliment but sounded like one. We've had concerns, he said, about continuity, about what happens if something. He paused carefully. If the circumstances around your father don't improve. My father's circumstances are private, she said, and the company's continuity structure should not depend on any individual's health, including mine, which is why I'm restructuring the operational decision authority this week. He blinked. The board hasn't reviewed. The board reviews executive decisions on a quarterly basis, she said. This is an executive operational restructuring, not a governance change. It doesn't require board approval. It requires my authority as controlling shareholder, which I have. He was quiet for a moment. The July meeting is still scheduled, she said, and at that meeting, I'll be presenting the restructuring framework. If the board determines that the new structure adequately addresses the continuity concerns, we won't need to discuss the committee proposal. If they determine it doesn't, we'll have that conversation at that time. She looked at him directly. I'm not here to fight with you, Gerald. I'm here to fix what needed fixing. If you have specific operational concerns, I want to hear them. If this is about governance philosophy, we can address that in July. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the expression of a man recalibrating a timeline. I look forward to the July presentation, he said. She drove back to the hotel that evening and called Victor from the parking garage. How did the Rawlings meeting go? She asked. He's persuadable, Victor said. He doesn't actually want the committee model. He wants to believe the current structure is stable. Then let's give him evidence that it is, she said. Pull the Q1 operational performance data for his division interests and prepare a summary showing decision velocity improvement since Monday. Monday, Victor repeated. That's 4 days. Clearance time on the stalled decisions was averaging 19 days before I arrived, she said. It's been under 48 hours this week. That's the number he needs to see. Yes, Miss Kensington. She hung up. She sat in the parking garage for a moment with the phone in her hand and thought about a parking lot in Cedar Ridge and a 9-year-old who had asked, in the direct way of children, "Are you coming back?" She thought about the answer she'd given him. "I plan to." She thought about Landon saying, standing at the shop door, that whatever she decided needed to be her decision, not something pulled from her by obligation or affection or the weight of things that needed filling. She thought about the fact that she'd been working since 5 this morning, and it was now 7 in the evening, and she had not once felt the specific exhaustion of someone doing work that didn't fit them. This fit her. This had always fit her. The problem had never been the work. The problem had been the belief that the work required everything else to be sacrificed for it. She thought about the shop, the color-coded scheduling tablet, the filing system she'd built on a Saturday morning. February revenue numbers she and Landon had looked at together. She thought about a boy doing a relay race in the Colorado spring and saying, without resentment, the other kid was just faster. It's not like I didn't run hard. She picked up the phone and called her father. He was in a rehabilitation facility outside Denver, and his recovery had been slow enough that optimism required effort, but steady enough that the effort was warranted. His voice on the phone was still his voice, the precise, considered voice of a man who chose his words carefully but slower than it had been, which was still hard to hear. "Sloane," he said. "Hi, Dad, you're in Denver." "Yes." She paused. "Fixing the board situation," Victor told me. A pause longer than it used to be. "How bad is it?" Hargrove overplayed. "He was counting on you being unavailable and me being absent. He got half of what he counted on." A sound that was, she thought, something like a laugh. "Gerald's always needed more patience than he's had. He has plenty. He just miscalculated the target." Another pause. "The shop," her father said, "in Cedar Ridge." She was quiet. Victor mentioned it, in passing. "I've been trying to picture it." He paused. "You fixed their operations." "Yes." "Without using." "Without using anything that wasn't mine to use," she said. "My time. My knowledge. That's all." Silence for a moment. Then, was it worth it? The question could have meant the time, the effort, the risk to the board position, the months away from headquarters. She understood he meant all of it, and she answered all of it. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "And then come see me this weekend." "Saturday morning," she said. "I'll bring coffee." She spent 6 weeks in Denver. Not exactly 641 days, which was close enough. She restructured the COO position and appointed a woman named Claire Avery, who had been the company's head of logistics for 7 years and had been doing half the COO job informally since October, without the title or the authority to do it efficiently. She restructured 2 board committees. She established a reporting framework that required her attention at a strategic level without requiring her presence in every operational decision. She presented the full framework at the July board meeting on a Thursday morning, answered every question Hargrove and his aligned members asked, and watched Rawlings, Brennan, and Chen vote with her against the committee proposal 12-3. She drove out of the parking structure that evening with the windows down. The drive to Cedar Ridge was 2 hours. She'd made it twice in the past 6 weeks, each way the Saturday she'd visited her father, which had gone longer than planned and which she didn't regret. She'd sat with him for 4 hours, and he'd told her things about building the company that he'd never told her before. Not strategic things, but the other kind, the things he'd gotten wrong, the costs he hadn't expected, the years that had moved past him while he was managing the quarter. "I was always going to do it differently after the next quarter," he'd said. "There was always going to be a point where I'd eased back." "You'll ease back now," she'd said. "Not how I planned," he said. "No." She'd been quiet for a moment. "But you're still here." He'd looked at her. He'd looked at her for a long time, in the way he looked at things he was assessing. The mechanic, he'd said, "Dad, I'm not prying." He'd said, with the tone of a man who was perhaps a little, "I'm observing." "Observe quieter," she'd said. He'd smiled the slowed version, but the same smile. "Bring him to see me," he'd said, "when the time is right." She'd driven back to Denver that evening and worked for the remaining weeks and done the job the way it needed to be done. And now she was driving west on a clear July evening with the Rockies catching the last light and her phone silent on the seats beside her, because she'd turned the work notifications off for the first time in 8 months. And she was thinking about a Saturday morning in October and a man lying on a creeper under a truck, and the specific catastrophic thing he'd said, and the fact that she'd turned around and almost left and hadn't. She pulled into Cedar Ridge at 9:15. The shop was dark closed hours ago, which she'd expected. She drove past it anyway, just to see it, the way you drove past things that had become significant to check that they were still there. The sign was visible in the streetlight. The lot was empty. The cedar tree at the edge of the property stood the way it always stood. She kept driving. She had a room at the inn on Maple where she'd stayed the 2 nights of her father's visit. She'd unpack, sleep, and go to the shop in the morning. She was reaching for her phone to confirm the reservation when it buzzed. Text from a number she had saved under Landon Pierce Auto Works, because that was how she'd saved it in October, professionally, and she'd never changed it. "Welcome back," it said. "Coffee's on me tomorrow." She looked at this for a moment in the dim of the car interior. Then she typed, "I'll hold you to that." A pause, then, "Schedule's full. 8 o'clock. She set the phone down. She looked at the Cedar Ridge Main Street through the windshield. The hardware store and the diner and the library with its one working exterior light, and the mountains sitting dark and enormous behind everything, the way they always sat, permanent and indifferent and strangely reassuring. She pulled into the inn lot. She turned off the engine. The following morning she arrived at the shop at 7:58. Landon was in the bay, already working, and the coffee was on the counter in a cup from the place 2 blocks over, which had become, at some point in the past 10 months, just where coffee came from. She hung up her jacket. She opened her laptop. She looked at the scheduling tablet on the wall, the same color-coded system, updated, current, with the week laid out in the particular order she recognized. Marcus came through from the back and said, without looking up from the clipboard he was carrying, "Morning, Sloane. Van 3 needs a brake line on the fleet schedule. I'll pull the service history," she said. She pulled the service history. Landon came to the doorway of the bay, wiping his hands on a shop rag, and looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "Good trip," he said. "Productive," she said. He nodded. Then he turned back to the bay. She turned back to the laptop. And somewhere in that ordinary exchange, the oil and the coffee and the brake line and the morning light coming through the shop window, something settled that had been unsettled for a long time, quiet and without announcement the way the best things settled. She was there. She had chosen to be there. Nobody had made it impossible to leave, and nobody had asked her to stay, and the choosing was therefore entirely hers, which was exactly what it needed to be. She opened the fleet tracking file and got to work. At lunch, Landon put a sandwich on her desk, the same deli order she'd been getting on Fridays since February, which he'd apparently remembered without being asked, and sat down across the counter on the stool that was, by long habit now, his stool. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. She looked up from the screen. He wasn't performing calm. He was genuinely calm, in the steady way he was genuinely most things. But there was a quality of care in how he was sitting she recognized as the posture of someone who had thought carefully about what they were about to say and was now saying it without the safety net of being able to take it back. "There's a sign," he said. "The original help wanted sign. I kept it." He paused. "I want you to know why I kept it." She waited. "When I put that ad up, I thought I needed someone to fix the business," he said. "And you did that. But that's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "Thought I was filling a hole. In the shop, He gestured, a general gesture. "In the whole situation. I thought if the right person came in and the right pieces clicked into place, I could stop feeling like something was missing." He looked at her steadily. "That's not what happened. What happened was I met someone who was a specific person. Not pieces of a puzzle, just a person. And that person happened to be you." The shop was quiet. Outside, a car moved past on the street. Somewhere in the back, Marcus was doing something mechanical and rhythmic. "I'm not asking you to fill anything," Landon said. "I'm asking whether what's here is something you want. Not because you owe this place something, or because Caleb needs it, or because you've built a life here temporarily that you're reluctant to dismantle. Because you want it." He paused. "Because I want it. And I'm done not saying that." She looked at him across the counter. She looked at this man with grease under his fingernails, and a deli order he'd remembered without being asked, and a son who said the other kid was just faster and meant it without bitterness. This man who had moved her schedule without telling her and stood his ground with Roland Mercer and said, "I should have asked you first," without defending himself. She reached into her bag and put a document on the counter. It was 8 pages, stapled, with a cover sheet that said Proposed Operating Partnership Agreement, Pierce Auto Works. I had this drafted, she said before the board meeting. Before I knew how it would go, she slid it across to him. I want to be your business partner. Formal legal, based on contributed value, not contributed capital. I don't want to buy in. I want to earn in, based on what I've already built here and what I'd continue to build. She looked at him. I have enough money to buy this shop 1,000 times. I don't want to do that. I want to be here because my work belongs here. Same as it did in October. He looked at the document. He looked at her. That's the business question, she said. There's also another question, which you just asked. And the answer to that one is yes. She paused. It's been yes for a while. I just needed to be sure I was saying it because I chose it. Landon looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the counter and put his hand over hers, not gripping, not pulling, just present, the way he was present with most things, steady and without performance. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. Outside, Cedar Ridge moved through its ordinary Thursday, and the coffee went cold in both their cups, and neither of them moved to fix it, and that was fine. The partnership agreement took 3 weeks to finalize, not because the terms were complicated, but because Landon read every page twice, asked questions about the sections he didn't understand, and refused to sign anything he couldn't explain in his own words. Sloane had expected this, and had in fact been counting on it. A man who signed documents he didn't understand was not a man she wanted as a partner. His lawyer, a woman named Patricia Osei, who worked out of a small office on Cedar Ridge's Main Street and had been handling Landon's business paperwork since the early years, reviewed the agreement with a thoroughness that Sloane recognized and respected. Patricia called her once, directly, to clarify the valuation methodology for Sloane's contributed work, and Sloane explained it fully. And Patricia said, "That's unusual." And Sloane said, "I know." And Patricia said, "My client understands what he's agreeing to." And Sloane said, "He will by the time he signs it." And Patricia said, "Good," and hung up. Landon signed it on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. He used the pen from the cup on the front counter, which was a ballpoint with a chewed cap that had been there for approximately 2 years. Sloane had brought a nicer pen. She didn't say anything about it. So he said, setting the pen down. So she said, "Partners, partners." He looked at the signed agreement on the counter. Then he looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of satisfaction. Not theatrical, not performed. Just a man registering that a thing was right. "Weird how that happened," he said. "You put up a help wanted sign," she said. "I did." He picked up the agreement and put it in the folder Patricia had prepared. Worst opening line in history. "It worked out," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "It did." The summer moved fast the way summers did in Cedar Ridge, the mountain light lasting long into the evenings, the town filling on weekends with people who had driven up from Denver and Colorado Springs, the shop running at a pace that required real management rather than the improvised scramble of the previous year. Claire Avery's had settled into the COO role at Kensington Dominion with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing the job informally for years and was relieved to finally be doing it officially. The board's July vote had quieted Hargrove without eliminating him, which Sloane had expected. You didn't eliminate people like Hargrove. You made their positions untenable through results, and results took time. She drove to Denver twice in August for board-required meetings, stayed 2 nights each time, visited her father on both trips. Harrison Kensington was moving with a cane now, which was better than the wheelchair of February, and worse than the man he'd been before October, and he was making a specific piece with the difference that Sloane watched him make without commenting on, because it was his piece to make, and he was making it in his own way and at his own pace. She brought him the quarterly operational summary on the second visit, because he'd asked for it, and he read it the way he'd always read reports, thoroughly, with a pen making small marks in the margins. "Claire Avery is good," he said. "She's excellent," Sloane said. She was always excellent. She just needed the authority to match what she was already doing. "I should have seen that," he said. "You were running 12 things at once," she said. "That's not an excuse." He set the report down. "It's an explanation. There's a difference." He looked at her, and in the look was something she recognized as the specific attention he'd given things that mattered to him across her whole life. The complete kind, without distraction, the kind that meant you were the only thing in the room. "You're good at this," he said. "Better than I was at your age. Maybe better than I ever was." She looked at him. "That's not true." "I built the company," he said. You improved it. Building is harder. Improving takes a different kind of intelligence. He paused. I had one. You have both. She didn't know what to do with this, so she picked up her coffee and looked out the window of the rehabilitation center's family room, which had a view of a parking lot and, beyond it, a line of cottonwood trees turning early gold at the edges. I want to bring someone to meet you, she said, when you're ready for visitors. Pause. The mechanic, he said, his name is Landon. And the boy, Caleb. She looked at her father. He's 9. He's going to ask you direct questions and not be embarrassed about them. Something moved in her father's face, something old and complicated, the expression of a man encountering a future he hadn't planned for and finding it, unexpectedly, not unwelcome. I look forward to it, he said, and she believed him. She drove back to Cedar Ridge that evening and arrived at the shop just after 7, which was an hour past closing. But the lights were on in the front room because Landon was still there doing the end-of-month inventory, which he did on the last Tuesday of every month, and which he was consistently 2 hours slower at than the task required because he cross-referenced things. She'd offered twice to build him a system that would reduce the time. He'd said he didn't mind doing it this way because it made him look at every item, and he liked knowing what was there. She came in and put her bag down and sat on the stool across the counter without saying anything, and he looked up from the shelves and said, "Good trip? Productive," she said, which was what she always said, and which had become the shorthand for it. Went well, and I'll tell you the details when I'm ready. Your father okay? Better, she said. He wants to meet you. Landon set down the clipboard. He looked at her with the expression of a man receiving information he needed a moment to process. Me specifically. Or you and Caleb, she said, both. He picked the clipboard back up. He made a mark. Okay, he said. He's not intimidating, she said. He built a $14 billion company from nothing. He's also in a rehabilitation facility using a cane, and he told me this afternoon that the physical therapist is 28 years old and knows nothing about how knees work in men over 60. She paused. Person. Landon almost smiled. I'll take your word for it. I'll set it up for September, she said. When he's more mobile. He nodded and went back to the inventory. She opened her laptop and went through the emails that had accumulated during the drive. They worked in comfortable parallel for an hour, the shop quiet around them, the Colorado evening doing its summer thing outside the window. At some point, Landon said, without looking up, Caleb asked me today if you were going to move in. She stopped typing. I didn't know what to say, he continued, still not looking up, in the tone of a man reporting a fact rather than an agenda. So I told him I didn't know yet. She looked at the side of his face. That was honest. I thought so. Now he did look up. He said he'd like it if you did. In case that's useful information. It's useful information, she said. He held her gaze. I'd like it too, he said, in case that's also useful. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her laptop screen. Then she looked back at him. I need to find something, she said, in Cedar Ridge. It needs to have enough space that Caleb has a real room, and it needs to have somewhere I can work from when I'm not at the shop, and it needs to not feel like something I moved into on a temporary basis. He was quiet for a moment. There's a house on the east end of Birch Street, he said. Been for sale since April. 3 bedrooms. Fenced yard. I drove past it in June. She looked at him. You drove past it in June. I noticed it in June, he said carefully. She considered this, the specific information of a man who had driven past a house and noticed it and not mentioned it for 6 weeks. Because she was in Denver, and the timing wasn't right, and he didn't make decisions for people. She thought about October, and a man lying on a creeper who had almost lost her in 4 words and recovered in an apology. She thought about all the ways they had both gotten things wrong and gotten things right, and the specific value of the ratio. Show me on the weekend, she said. Saturday morning, he said, after opening. Obviously, he said, and went back to the inventory. She bought the house on Birch Street in September. It needed work. The kitchen was outdated. The back fence had a section that had given up, and someone in the previous decade had made a series of decisions about the bathroom tile that could not be defended, but the bones were right, and the yard was real, and the 3rd bedroom had a window that caught the morning light in a Caleb that stood in for about 30 seconds when they walked through it and then turned to Sloane and said, "This one's mine," without a question mark. She said obviously, and he grinned. Landon fixed the fence himself over 2 weekends. He didn't announce he was going to fix it. He showed up with tools and did it. She watched him from the kitchen window on the 2nd Saturday, drinking coffee she'd made in the new kitchen, and thought about the specific mathematics of a person who demonstrated things through action rather than statement. It was not a perfect quality. It had gotten him into trouble before, in the Roland Mercer situation, in the ways he'd occasionally made decisions about her circumstances without asking. But it was a real quality, rooted in something genuine, and she had stopped wanting people to be without flaws a long time ago. Flaws were just the edges of a thing. They told you its shape. Harrison Kensington came to Cedar Ridge in late September. He drove himself, which his physical therapist had cleared him for, and which Sloane had expected him to do regardless of clearance. He arrived on a Saturday morning, which she had not coordinated. He'd called Friday evening and said he'd be there around 10. She'd told Landon, who had received this information with the expression of a man making internal adjustments, and then had shown up at the shop Saturday morning with a clean shirt and the particular manner of someone who had decided not to be visibly nervous and was mostly succeeding. Harrison Kensington walked into Pierce Auto Works at 10:12 with a cane and without an assistant and in clothes that were good without being formal. A man who had made a specific decision about how to arrive. He looked at the shop, the way he'd looked at the quarterly report. Thoroughly, attentively, without rushing to judgment. "Sloane," he said. "Dad," she kissed him on the cheek. "This is Landon." The two men looked at each other. Harrison was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the particular physical presence of someone who had once been physically substantial and was reassembling it after difficulty. Landon was 32, in his clean shirt, with grease he'd missed under the edge of his left thumbnail, and the steady way he stood when he was standing his ground, without making it a confrontation. They shook hands. "I've heard a lot about the shop," Harrison said. "I've heard a lot about you," Landon said. "Good things, I hope." "Complicated things," Landon said. "But mostly good." Harrison looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Sloane with an expression she recognized as the one he used when he'd received information confirming a prior assessment. "Show me around," he said. Landon showed him around. He was not performative about it. He didn't narrate the improvements or explain what the shop had been before Sloane arrived, because Harrison hadn't asked for a comparison. He showed him the bays, the lift, the diagnostic equipment, the fleet documentation system on the tablet, the wall schedule that still existed alongside the digital one, because Landon still liked being able to look up and see the week. Caleb arrived from a friend's house at 11:15 and walked in without any awareness that he should be managing his entrance. He dropped his bag, said "Hi, Sloane," then registered the older man, standing in the front room, and stopped. "Hi," he said. "Hello," Harrison said. "You must be Caleb."
Yeah.
"Who are you?" "Caleb," Landon said. "It's fine," Harrison said. "I'm Sloane's father." Caleb processed this. He looked at Sloane, then at Harrison, then at Landon. "Does that make you like—" He paused, working through the relationship taxonomy. "Her dad." "So are you like a grandfather situation?" The room was briefly very quiet. Harrison looked at Caleb with an expression that moved through something complicated and arrived somewhere unexpected. "I don't know," he said. "What do you think?" Caleb considered this seriously, which was how he considered most things. "I think that's probably a conversation for later," he said, with the wisdom of a 10-year-old who had absorbed, through proximity, the information that some questions took time. Then he went to get his homework from his bag. Harrison looked at Landon. Landon looked at Harrison. Some kind of unspoken accounting happened between them. Not a transaction, just a recognition. "He's a good kid," Harrison said. "He is," Landon said. "He wasn't always this okay. He's been working at it." Harrison nodded slowly. "So have I," he said. They had lunch at the pizza place on Elm, all four of them. In the booth by the window, which was becoming, Sloane thought, the booth by the window where things happened. Harrison ate carefully and asked Caleb questions about school with the specific attention of a man who had decided that attention was what the situation required, and Caleb answered with the direct honesty that was his particular gift. At one point, Harrison asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and Caleb said, "I'm not sure yet. Either a mechanic or someone who figures out why things work the way they do." "The same job," Harrison said. Caleb looked at him. "Huh," he said, "yeah." Harrison looked at Sloane across the table with something she hadn't seen from him in years, something lighter, or maybe just less burdened, like a room with a window opened. She didn't point it out. She just noted it. It's the way she noted things that mattered. He drove back to Denver that afternoon. At the car, he hugged her longer than he usually did, which was an adjustment he'd been making in small increments since the accident, and which she received each time with the particular care of someone handling something that had become newly fragile and was trying to become less so. Good, he said. Just that. She understood he meant all of it. The fall came in the way Colorado fall came, fast and specific, the aspens going gold at the higher elevations first, and then the color descending, the mornings getting sharp, the shop picking up the pre-winter service rush that Landon had told her about and she'd planned for. They hired a third mechanic, a woman named Rosa, who had 10 years of experience, and a precise way with engines that Marcus said was better than his own, which was the highest compliment Marcus gave. Rosa started in October, which meant she started 1 year after Sloane had started, and the symmetry of this was not lost on Sloane, who noted it privately and said nothing about it, because noting symmetries aloud was not her habit. The partnership had changed things at the shop in ways that were both practical and harder to name. The practical changes were visible. Sloane had formal authority now over the operational decisions she'd been making informally anyway, which meant she could move faster on certain things and didn't need to frame every suggestion as a suggestion rather than a decision. Landon had formal acknowledgement of a working relationship he'd built over a year, which seemed to matter to him not for what it said about status, but for what it said about permanence. This is a real thing, the signed paper said. Not temporary, not provisional. The harder-to-name change was that they argued more. Not badly. They had never been the kind of people who got ugly in disagreements, and they both had enough self-knowledge to know when they were being defensive rather than right. But they pushed back on each other with more directness now, less of the careful professional courtesy that had cushioned the early months. Landon would tell her when he thought she was overcomplicating something. She would tell him when she thought he was making a decision based on habit rather than current information. They were both right often enough that neither of them dismissed the other on reflex, and wrong often enough that neither of them stopped listening. It was, Sloane thought, the most functional working relationship she'd ever had, which said something, she acknowledged, about the working relationships she'd had before. The first anniversary arrived on a Tuesday in October. She knew the date before the day came. She'd known it for a week, not in the way you tracked birthdays or holidays, marked in a phone calendar with a reminder, but in the quieter way that significant things surfaced as their dates approached, rising up through the texture of daily life like objects becoming visible as water receded. A year ago, she'd driven through a Colorado storm to a garage she'd found through an online ad, carrying a resume that was both accurate and incomplete, ready to start a chapter of her life that she couldn't have described to anyone who'd asked because she hadn't had the words for what she needed. She'd almost left in the first 60 seconds. She'd stayed because a man who was clearly exhausted and socially disastrous had apologized with a sincerity she hadn't expected, and because she'd walked in ready to assess an operation and had found one that was broken in the interesting way. Not rotted through, but simply without the structure to support what it was genuinely capable of. She'd found other things she hadn't been looking for. On the anniversary morning, she arrived at the shop at 7:50 and found something sitting on her desk. It was the original Help Wanted sign. The actual one she recognized, the slight water damage at one corner. The particular handwriting Landon used before he'd learned to use the shop's label maker, the sun fading along one edge from where it had sat in the window. Picked it up. She turned it over. On the back, in the same handwriting, 4 words. We built this together. She stood at her desk, holding the sign for a moment. Not performing a motion, just holding it and registering what it was. The specific weight of a year condensed into a piece of cardboard and 4 words. Landon came in from the bay at 8, wiping his hands, and looked at her holding the sign. Found it in the back, he said. Thought you should have it. She looked at him. You should have half. It's a sign, he said. You can't split a sign. You can lean it somewhere between us. He looked at the sign. Then he looked at the space between their 2 work areas, her desk, his counter, the gap they moved through 100 times a day, with coffee and clipboards and customer paperwork. Yeah, he said. Okay. She set it in the space between them, leaning against the wall, where both of them could see it. Rosa arrived at 8:10 and looked at the sign and said, New decoration? And Landon said, something like that, and Rosa shrugged and went to her bay, and the morning began. The year had built something to Sloane in her something October of the previous year. Could not have drawn a blueprint for him before, because she hadn't known the shape it would take. A shop that ran. A filing system she was irrationally attached to. A fleet contract that had grown into a regional reputation. house on Birch Street with a fixed fence and a third bedroom that got the morning light. A boy who said she remembers stuff most people forget, who was now 10 years old and had started asking questions about engines, because the shop was where he spent his afternoons, and engines were what the shop was about. And Landon. She had thought in the early months that what she was building was evidence proof that she could create value without her name or her money doing the work for her. She had been right about that. The evidence was real, and she was glad to have it, glad in the specific way you were glad about something that had required genuine effort and had produced genuine result. But what she hadn't anticipated was that the building itself would become the thing. Not what it proved, but what it was. Not the evidence, but the life. She had spent years in rooms where everyone agreed with her, and then gone to a room where a man under a truck said the wrong thing entirely, and a small boy got fractions wrong, and the invoices were in no order, and the coffee was terrible. And somehow that room, that specific and imperfect room, was where she had been most fully herself. Not the Kensington heir managing the optics of her presence, not the executive calibrating her authority in a board meeting, but a person with skills who applied them to problems that needed solving and received, in return, the particular satisfaction of work that was real. She'd brought that back to Denver with her, and it had made her better at Denver. Clearer. Less willing to defer decisions that didn't require deferral. Less interested in the performance of authority and more interested in its actual exercise. Claire Avery had told her 3 months into the new structure that the company felt differentless, like something waiting for permission, and more like something that knew what it was doing. Sloane had said, good, and meant it, and understood that she knew now how to build structures that supported the work rather than supplanting it, because she'd spent 8 months doing exactly that in 3 bays in Colorado. The morning ran. Vehicles came in and went out. Marcus found a problem in a timing chain that he'd suspected, but couldn't confirm until he had the engine open, and he came to Landon with the news and the cost implication, and Landon went to the customer, and the customer was not happy. And Landon explained the situation without apology or over-explanation, and the customer agreed to the repair because Landon's shop had a reputation now that made the conversation short. Rosa finished a brake job and started on the next vehicle. Sloane handled the fleet scheduling call and the parts order, and a follow-up from a new client who had found them through Roland Mercer's recommendation and was considering bringing in a small fleet of delivery vehicles. At noon, Caleb arrived, which he wasn't supposed to because it was a school day. He appeared in the doorway, looking like someone who had very recently made a decision that he was confident about and slightly nervous about simultaneously. He was carrying his backpack and a piece of paper. You're supposed to be in school, Landon said. I have a half day, Caleb said. Forgot to tell you. He looked at Sloane. I made something. Put the piece of paper on her desk. It was a drawing. Caleb was 10 and not a natural visual artist. The drawing was earnest rather than technically accomplished, which made it more rather than less. It showed 3 figures in front of a building that was clearly meant to be the shop, identified by the sign he'd drawn above the door. The 3 figures were labeled in his handwriting, Dad, me, Sloane. Below the building he'd written, in larger letters, Pierce Auto Works, and then, below that, in letters he'd clearly worked harder on, EST, together. Sloane looked at the drawing for a moment. She looked at Caleb, who was watching her with the specific anxiety of someone who had made something and was waiting to see if it landed. S together, she said. Where'd you get that? The sign, he said, gesturing to the cardboard sign leaning against the wall. He looked at it. We built this together. I just thoughtest. Is like established, right? Like when companies put when they started. And this started when you came. Landon was looking at his son with an expression that was doing its best not to be what it was, which was the expression of a man whose chest had been reached into. Yeah, Sloane said. That's right. So can we put it on the sign, Caleb asked. Like the real sign outside. Landon looked at Sloane. She looked at him. We'll figure out the lettering, Landon said. Caleb nodded, satisfied, and went to the desk in the corner and opened his backpack with the efficiency of someone whose afternoon had been planned and was now proceeding according to plan. Sloane looked at the drawing. She looked at the cardboard sign. She looked at the shop, the bays, and the lift, and the scheduling tablet, and the tool wall, and Rose's head visible through the bay window, and Marcus's boots under a Jeep, and she thought about the woman who had walked into this building a year ago, carrying a resume and a secret, and the very reasonable suspicion that neither would be enough. She thought about what she'd found instead of proof. She thought about the specific way that Landon had stood at the door when she left for Denver, not pulling her back, not manufacturing reasons to stay, not filling the space her leaving created with anything other than the honest acknowledgement that he wanted her to come back and would not make that her obligation. She had driven away from that conversation understanding something that she hadn't had the language for before, that the rarest thing was not love, not even the patient kind. The rarest thing was being loved by someone who had enough respect for your life to let you live it, and enough conviction about their own to wait. She had not had that before. She had not known to look for it. She was not sure she deserved it, which was the thing about deserving. It rarely lined up with what you actually received, and you had to decide whether to accept the gift anyway or hold it at arm's length until the accounting felt correct. She had decided to accept it. That was the thing nobody told you about building something real with another person. It was not the grand gestures or the significant moments, though those existed. It was the accumulated weight of small things. Coffee remembered, schedules rearranged, a fence repaired without announcement, a question asked instead of decided. It was the specific courage of saying yes to something impermanent and imperfect and true, in a world that kept offering you the option of something controlled and safe and hollow. She had lived in the hollow version for a long time. She knew its texture. She knew the specific exhaustion of rooms where everyone agreed with you, the loneliness of being known only as a function of your wealth, the way that kind of recognition slowly eroded your sense of your own reality, until you weren't sure anymore what you actually were, underneath the name and the money. She knew what she was now. She was a woman who could look at a broken system and understand where the losses were. She was a woman who could sit with a struggling child and find the exact point of confusion without making him feel stupid for having it. She was a woman who could walk into a board meeting and be the most prepared person in the room, not because of who her father was, but because she had done the work. She was a woman who had chosen when she didn't have to, when no external pressure required it, when the choice was entirely hers, this shop, this town, this man, this boy. The choosing was the thing. Not the result of the choice, but the act of it. The clear-eyed, uncoerced, nobody's fault but yours decision to say, this is what I want. And I am going to be honest about wanting it. And I am going to build it the same way I build everything worth building. Through work, through attention, through showing up at 8 o'clock and doing what I said I'd do. There was no clean lesson in it. Life didn't produce clean lessons. It produced people, changed by experience, making their best attempt at the next thing. Sloane had not arrived at some perfect version of herself. She still managed more than she shared. She still occasionally let the work distance her from the people doing it alongside her. She still had weeks when the pressure of the company and the shop and the complexity of her father's recovery accumulated in ways she handled alone rather than asking for help, and Landon had, twice now, gently pointed that out. And both times, she had been annoyed before she recognized he was right. He was not a simple man to love, either. He was stubborn about certain things. The scheduling system that was less efficient than it needed to be, the way he sometimes talked to difficult customers past the point where efficiency required it, because he needed them to understand rather than just agree. He moved slowly toward things he felt, taking his time with emotions the way he took his time with engines, not because he was withholding, but because he was thorough. He had a bad week in November when the revenue numbers dipped, and he reverted briefly to the solitary grinding mode of the year before Sloane arrived, working too long and eating badly and not asking for the thing he needed, which was someone to tell him the dip was seasonal and the fundamentals were fine. She told him. He acknowledged it, went home, slept, and came back the next morning as himself again. That was the other thing nobody told you. Not the falling everyone talked about the falling, but the staying. Staying was the real thing. The staying when the other person was in their less available version. The staying when the month was hard. The staying when you had to say the uncomfortable thing rather than leave it comfortable and unaddressed. The staying was where the building happened. By December, Pierce Auto Works was running its second full winter with Sloane as partner, and the difference between this winter and the previous one was the difference between a business that was surviving and a business that knew what it was. The fleet contract had generated 2 new referral accounts. Rosa had become, within 4 months, the mechanic that customers specifically requested, which was a development that required Landon to have a conversation with Marcus about how that worked in a shop where everyone's contribution mattered and no one was disposable. It was an awkward conversation, and he handled it imperfectly, and then handled the follow-up conversation better. And Marcus said, in his particular way, "I get it," which meant he actually got it. Caleb turned 10 in November and had a birthday party that was the first birthday party in 4 years that Landon felt was genuinely attended rather than arranged 6 kids. Pizza from Elm Street, a yard that now had a fixed fence, and a level of noise that made the Birch Street neighbors briefly consider their life choices. Sloane had organized the logistics, and Landon had grilled things and burned 2 of them, and refused to acknowledge the burning until Caleb pointed it out, and it was fine. It was all fine. On the last evening of the year, after the shop was closed, and Caleb was asleep in the 3rd bedroom with the morning light, and the house on Birch Street was quiet in the particular way of houses that had recently contained noise and were settling back into themselves, Landon and Sloane sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of dinner and the specific companionship of 2 people who had run out of necessary conversation and were comfortable in the silence that came after. She had the drawing Caleb had made in October. She'd had it framed, a simple frame, nothing elaborate, and it was on the wall in the front room of the shop now, between the scheduling tablet and the window that looked out onto the lot. Pierce Auto Works, est together. The 3 figures in front, earnest and slightly off proportion, labeled a 10-year-old's handwriting. She thought about telling Landon what she'd been thinking, then decided against it, then looked at him across the table and changed her mind again. "I was afraid," she said, "when I drove here in October. Not of the job. I was afraid that I'd come here and discover I couldn't do it without the name and the money behind me." He looked at her. "And I could." She paused. "I could do it. The work was real. The results were real." She looked at her hands. "I don't need to prove it again. I know it now. That's—" She stopped. "I didn't expect that to matter as much as it does." "Why does it?" he said. She thought about it. "Because before, I never knew which version was real. The one who could build things, or the one who got credit for building things because of who she was. And the not knowing," she stopped again. "It made everything feel provisional. Like it could all be taken away if the name and the money went. Like I wasn't actually the source of any of it." He was quiet for a moment. "And now? Now I know," she said. "I built the filing system. I built the fleet contract. She stopped. "I know what I did. Nobody can take that away because the record is here. Marcus knows it. Rosa knows it. Roland Mercer's office manager sends me fruit every April." She almost smiled. "I know what I did." "You know what you did," he agreed. She looked at him. "That's why this matters," she said. "Not just because of—" She gestured, indicating him the house, the general situation. "But because this is where I found out. I needed somewhere that meant nothing about who I was born as. And this was it. You were it. You never knew what I was worth, and you hired me anyway, and you asked me to stay at the table with Roland, and you said I should have asked you first, instead of explaining why you were right." She looked at her hands again. "That's not a small thing." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you drove through a storm to a garage that was losing $11,000 a year, and the first thing I said to you was that I needed a wife." She looked at him. "Not my best moment," he said. She held his gaze. "No," she said, "but you apologized, and you meant it. And that turned out to be more important than the $11,000. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand in a hand. The specific weight of 2 people who had chosen each other through the imperfect ordinary accumulation of a year. Outside Cedar Ridge was quiet. The mountains were there the way they were always there. Dark and enormous and permanent, doing nothing except existing with the conviction of things that had been there long enough to stop needing to justify their presence. Inside, the house was warm, and the dishes needed doing, and Caleb would be awake in 8 hours, and the shop would open in 9. And there were 3 vehicles due in Monday morning, and a fleet service call scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. Everything was unfinished, in the way that living things were unfinished. Everything was ongoing. Everything was, in the only sense that mattered, exactly where it needed to be. She hadn't bought a family. She had chosen one with full knowledge, with open eyes, with the understanding that choosing was the thing that made it real, and they had chosen her back. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.